Hello there. Please set your volume to a gentle level. Find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let your mind settle. Together, we'll drift into sleep with the first story in our Boring History for Sleep series. Tonight, we begin with the observatories of the Mayan priests. If you enjoy these calming bedtime journeys, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring more together. The ancient lands of the Maya stretched across the dense jungles and rolling hills of what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. It was a world where the air hung heavy with the scent of rain and the chorus of insects, and where stone cities rose unexpectedly from the green sea of the forest. Among these cities, with their towering temples and broad plazas, there stood certain structures that seemed to serve a different purpose than mere worship or display of power. These were the observatories of the Mayan priests, places where the sky was studied with a patience and precision that could rival even the most advanced instruments of the modern age. To the Maya, the heavens were not just a distant canvas of stars, they were a living, breathing map of the gods' will. The priests, dressed in flowing garments and adorned with feathers and jade, would climb to the top of these observatories and watch the movement of the sun, the moon, and the bright wanderers we now call planets. They did not have telescopes or metal tools, yet they marked the passage of Venus with such accuracy that modern astronomers have marveled at their records. In the city of Uxmal, the so-called governor's palace was aligned so that its central doorway pointed exactly to the position of Venus on certain key dates. In Chichen Itza, the round structure known as El Caracol, meaning the snail in Spanish, for its spiral staircase, was built with windows and openings that framed specific points of sunrise and sunset, as well as the extreme positions of the moon during its long cycles. These alignments were no accident. They were the result of generations of careful observation, recorded in bark paper codices, and passed down through apprenticeships that could last decades. To lie within the shadowed chamber of El Caracol at dawn and watch the first light of the solstice sun spill perfectly through a narrow opening must have been an experience both humbling and powerful. The priests believed that these celestial events signaled times for planting maize, for holding ceremonies, and for preparing for the challenges of the seasons ahead. The agricultural life of the Maya was bound tightly to the rhythm of the heavens, and the priests were the keepers of that rhythm. They would rise before the rest of the city, climbing their towers in the quiet hours before the light, when the air was cool and the stars were still sharp. They carried with them simple tools, perhaps a length of knotted cord, a carved staff, or a flat stone to mark the horizon. By watching where a star rose in relation to a distant hill, or how the moon passed between two carved pillars, they could measure time with remarkable accuracy. These observations were not kept for idle curiosity. They formed the backbone of the Mayan calendar systems, including the 260-day sacred count and the 365-day solar year, both of which intertwined in a repeating cycle known as the calendar round. Every 52 years, these cycles would align, and such a moment was seen as a time of renewal, often marked by great ceremonies. Within the observatories, the air would be still except for the faint rustle of the priest's garments and the low murmur of chants. A burning torch might flicker in the windless chamber, casting light on the smooth stone walls. Outside, the jungle whispered with unseen life, and above, the constellations wheeled in their eternal dance. To the Maya, these were not random patterns. Each star had a story, a name, a role in the great cosmic order. Some represented animals, some gods, some past kings whose spirits had ascended to join the sky. Night after night, year after year, the priests watched, learned, and recorded, so that when the time came for a ceremony or a planting, the people could act in harmony with the will of the heavens. These observatories were more than stone. They were the bridge between earth and sky, between the mortal and the divine, a reminder that the answers to life's mysteries might be found not by looking around us, but by looking up. The role of the Mayan priests as astronomers went beyond the mere act of watching the sky. It was an ongoing dialogue between human beings and the vast, silent expanse above them. In the minds of the Maya, the universe was a layered realm, with the heavens above, the earthly plane in the middle, and the underworld below, all connected by the world tree that stretched through time and space. Observatories were built not only to track celestial movements, but to anchor the city itself to this cosmic order. standing within these structures, one could almost feel the weight of centuries pressing in, the knowledge of countless generations etched invisibly into the angles of the stone. Imagine the nights when the air was clear and the Milky Way arched like a river of light across the sky. The priest would know its position by heart, noting how it shifted with the seasons. They understood that its movements were tied to the cycles of rain and drought, planting and harvest. For a people whose survival depended so heavily on agriculture, this knowledge was as vital as any tool or weapon. The priests were not scientists in the modern sense, yet their observations followed patterns of discipline, repetition, and verification. They might mark a position one night, then check it again the next, and again a year later, ensuring that nothing was recorded in haste. In the sacred city of Tikal, certain temples were aligned so that the setting sun at the equinox would sink precisely between two distant structures, a sight visible from a specific vantage point. Such alignments could only be achieved through long-term, systematic study, perhaps begun by a priest who never lived to see the final proof of his calculations, but whose successors continued the work until the day it all fell into place. These observations shaped not only the calendar, but the rhythm of daily life. Markets opened and closed on particular days. Marriages were arranged at times deemed auspicious. Journeys were begun under certain phases of the moon to ensure protection on the road. The observatories were therefore not isolated places for the elite. They were the silent heartbeats of the city, dictating the flow of life for farmers, merchants, warriors, and rulers alike. Within their rounded walls or atop their stepped platforms, the priests might spend hours in stillness, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for a star to emerge in just the right place. Sometimes they would work in pairs, one watching while the other recorded with careful strokes on a folded codex. The materials were fragile, bark paper coated with lime and painted with mineral pigments, but the information they held was enduring. Even when Spanish conquerors arrived and burned many of these books, the knowledge survived in the minds of the few who remembered, and in the stones themselves, whose alignments could still whisper their ancient truths. These priests also paid close attention to Venus, a planet that held deep significance for the Maya. They tracked its morning and evening appearances, noting the intervals when it vanished from view. To them, Venus was tied to the god of war and often used to time the start of military campaigns. The observatories became both instruments of peace and tools of strategy, guiding planting one season and battle the next. Over time, each city's observatory developed its own character. Some were massive and formal, with grand staircases and decorated facades, while others were simple, functional towers of stone. Regardless of size, their purpose was the same: to create a place where the human gaze could meet the infinite and find order in its apparent chaos. The stillness of these places was profound. Even today, standing within the ruins, one can feel the silence pressing in, broken only by the whisper of wind or the cry of a distant bird. The sky above remains the same one the priests once studied, its stars unchanging in their patterns, though our world has shifted and grown beyond anything they could have imagined. And yet their work lives on, woven into the fabric of history, a testament to the enduring human desire to understand where we are in the vastness of space and time. In the heart of the Maya world, the priests who tended the observatories carried a weight of responsibility that few could match. They were not only watchers of the sky, but also interpreters of its meaning, bridging the gap between the ordinary lives of farmers and artisans and the grand, unseen movements of the cosmos. Every shift of light at dawn, every glimmer of a star at dusk, was part of a language they had learned to read over a lifetime. The people trusted them to know when the rains would come, when the sun would stand still at the solstice, and when it was time to honor the gods with offerings and festivals. To fulfill this role, the priests often lived apart from the bustle of daily city life, dwelling in quarters close to the observatory itself. Their days followed a rhythm as steady as the celestial cycles they studied. Before sunrise, they would climb the worn stone steps to the viewing platform, their bare feet or leather sandals whispering against the cool surface. They might carry a bundle of tools, simple yet refined, such as sighting rods carved from wood, strings weighted with stones for alignment, or shells and polished stones used to mark time. As the first colors of dawn spilled across the horizon, they would watch for the appearance of Venus or the fading of certain stars, making careful notes in the codices or on memory boards. These early hours were followed by study, prayer, and instruction for younger apprentices. Learning to read the sky was not a task of days or months, but of decades. A young apprentice might begin by simply observing alongside his teacher, memorizing the position of constellations and the timing of lunar phases. Over time, he would be entrusted with small measurements, then complex calculations, until at last he could stand alone in the quiet pre-dawn light and know exactly what the heavens were telling him. The observatories themselves were designed with this kind of precision in mind. In some, narrow slits in the walls allowed only a thin shaft of sunlight to enter on specific days, creating a glowing line that aligned with a carved mark or symbol. In others, doorways and windows framed exact points on the horizon where the sun or moon would rise or set at particular times of the year. These architectural choices were deliberate, refined through generations of building and rebuilding until the stones stood in perfect harmony with the sky. Such alignments required an understanding of geometry and engineering that is impressive even today. Yet for the Maya, this was not purely technical knowledge, it was sacred. The act of watching the heavens was a form of worship, a way to remain in balance with the forces that governed both the crops in the fields and the fate of the rulers. The people might not know the full details of the priest's work, but they felt its effects. When the rains arrived as predicted, when the harvest was plentiful, when the festivals coincided with beautiful celestial displays, the trust between the priests and the people deepened. That trust, however, could be fragile. A miscalculation could have serious consequences, not just in the fields, but in the spiritual life of the city. It is said that during rare eclipses, the Maya believed the balance of the world was in danger, and the priests were called upon to perform elaborate rituals to ensure the safety of the sun and moon. In such moments, the observatories became stages for ceremonies involving fire, incense, and chanting, the walls echoing with the sound of conch shells and drums. Even the surrounding jungle seemed to hold its breath. The priests would stand in their appointed places, watching for the precise moment when the shadow would pass and the light would return, their success a reassurance to the people that all was well once more. These moments of drama were rare, but they reinforced the idea that the observatories were more than buildings. They were living instruments, attuned to the great cycles that bound heaven and earth together. Standing in one today, amid the weathered stones and the hum of insects, it is not hard to imagine the quiet figures who once kept their vigil there, eyes lifted to the same sky we see now, finding meaning in its endless patterns. Among the most fascinating aspects of the Mayan observatories was the way they blended architecture, astronomy, and ceremony into a seamless whole. These were not cold, isolated towers built only for calculation. They were living spaces where the spiritual and the scientific coexisted, where every stone had a purpose and every shadow could carry meaning. The priests who tended them understood that the movement of the heavens was not separate from human life, but woven into its very fabric. To study the sun was to study the timing of the rains. To follow the moon was to understand the tides and the rhythms of fertility. To track the wanderings of Venus was to anticipate the cycles of conflict and peace. In the great city of Copan, Farsa, for example, the observatory platforms were positioned so that during the solstices and equinoxes, the sun's path would align with carved stelae, depicting rulers and deities, visually tying the authority of kings to the eternal order of the cosmos. Such alignments reinforced the idea that the ruler's power was divinely sanctioned, as if the heavens themselves had set him upon his throne. In other cities, observatories were connected to ceremonial causeways, so that processions during important festivals would move in direct alignment with celestial events. One can imagine the scene: the slow beat of drums, the scent of copal resin burning in clay censers, the rhythmic steps of dancers in elaborate feathered costumes, all timed so that the climax of the ritual coincided with the setting sun or the first gleam of a planet in the darkening sky. These spectacles were as much about reinforcing communal belief as they were about tracking astronomical data. The observatories, then, were both theaters and instruments, stages for performances that were deeply symbolic and meticulously timed. The priests themselves often lived in a cycle of preparation and observation, their work stretching over months and years for a single perfect moment when an alignment occurred. Some alignments happened annually, others only once every many years, and some in cycles so long that no single priest could witness them twice in his lifetime. The dedication required to track such events was immense. and it was sustained by a belief system that saw time not as a straight line, but as a repeating circle. In the Mayan worldview, events of the past could echo into the present, and by knowing the patterns of the heavens, one could anticipate when certain influences might return. This cyclical vision of time was recorded in their complex calendar systems, which the observatories helped keep accurate. Their solar calendar was astonishingly precise, deviating from the true solar year by only a fraction of a day, an achievement remarkable for a civilization without modern instruments. This accuracy was no accident. It was the result of constant, careful adjustment, each observatory acting as a checkpoint where the movements of sun and stars could be verified. As centuries passed, the knowledge preserved in these observatories became part of the cultural inheritance of the Maya, passed through generations even as cities rose and fell. Today, standing in the crumbling remains of these structures, with vines curling through the stonework and the jungle reclaiming its space, it is still possible to sense their purpose. The sightlines carved into their walls remain true, framing the horizon in ways that reveal their builders' intentions. When the solstice sun still rises in its appointed gap, or when the moon still peers through a narrow window at the exact angle intended centuries ago, it is as if the voices of those long-departed priests speak again, quietly affirming that their work endures. The observatories are not simply relics. They are still in conversation with the sky, as they have always been, waiting for the next patient watcher to understand their language. As the centuries unfolded, the observatories of the Mayan priests continued to serve as both practical tools and sacred spaces, their importance woven into every layer of society. They were often situated at elevated points within the city or on natural rises in the landscape, granting an unobstructed view of the horizon in all directions. This placement was deliberate, ensuring that no mountain ridge or thick canopy could block the first glimmer of sunrise or the fading edge of a setting star. From these vantage points, the priests could see not just the sky above, but also the land around them, mapping the relationship between celestial events and the world they inhabited. They watched how the sun's path shifted slowly from north to south across the horizon over the course of a year, marking the solstices when it reached its extremes and the equinoxes when it balanced in the middle. Each of these moments carried significance in Mayan ritual life, serving as anchors in the flow of time. The observatories also became places where knowledge converged. Astronomy, architecture, agriculture, religion, and governance all found common ground here. A record of the heavens was not simply an academic pursuit. It was the key to ensuring the prosperity of crops, the timing of diplomatic missions, and the scheduling of trade expeditions. If a city planned a large-scale exchange of goods, the priest might choose a date aligned with the favorable position of Venus, believing such timing would bless the venture with success. In this way, the observatories influenced decisions that rippled through the economy and politics of the Maya world. Within the walls of these structures, the air often remained cooler than the sweltering heat outside, a quiet refuge where the sounds of the city softened. A narrow slit of sunlight creeping across the floor could signal the turning of a season, just as reliably as any spoken word. At night, when the city below had fallen into rest, the observatory would come alive again, not with noise, but with the steady presence of watchers on the platform, scanning the darkness for the first sign of a planet's return or the slow drift of a familiar constellation. Sometimes, clouds would obscure the sky, forcing the priest to wait in patient silence, trusting that the heavens would reveal themselves in their own time. When the clouds broke and a long-awaited star appeared exactly where it was expected, it reaffirmed their faith in the patterns they had studied for so long. These moments of confirmation were quiet victories, shared only among those who had invested years in preparation. The precision of their work was such that they could predict events far in advance: eclipses, solstice sunrises, the reappearance of Venus after its time hidden in the sun's glare. These predictions were not presented casually, they were unveiled during ceremonies, lending a sense of awe to the occasion. The people might not understand the calculations behind them, but they saw the results. The priests had spoken, and the sky had obeyed. Even today, standing among the remnants of these observatories, one can imagine the steady hands and focused eyes of those who tended them. The stones still hold the warmth of countless sunrises. The floors still remember the soft tread of leather sandals, and the view from the top still offers the same unbroken sweep of horizon. Time has shifted the world around them, but the paths of the sun, moon, and stars remain constant, linking us to those distant watchers who measured their days and their lives by the turning of the sky. Over time, the observatories became not only centers for celestial study, but also markers of continuity, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of dynasties, the shifting alliances between cities, and the slow changes in the landscape itself. The jungle crept closer with each passing decade, vines twining around carved stone, roots pressing into the mortar, yet the structures remained steadfast, their purpose unchanged. Generations of priests came and went, each inheriting the meticulous records of their predecessors, adding their own observations, and passing the knowledge onward like a torch that could never be allowed to go out. The continuity of this work was a source of pride, for it meant that the city remained in harmony with the greater order of the cosmos. Within the observatories, rituals marked the turning points of the year. At the solstices, the chambers would fill with a golden beam of sunlight that struck a specific point on the wall or floor, a signal that the cycle of seasons had shifted once again. At the equinoxes, the rising or setting sun would align perfectly with an entrance or window, bathing the interior in a brief, balanced light that felt almost otherworldly. These moments were occasions for quiet reverence, not noisy celebration, the kind of events where the gathered priests might bow their heads and murmur prayers, acknowledging that the patterns they had tracked for months had arrived exactly as expected. Such precision strengthened their belief that the world was ordered, and that they, as keepers of that order, were fulfilling their sacred duty. At night, the observatories revealed their other purpose. Without the glare of modern lights, the sky was a dark canvas scattered with uncountable stars, the Milky Way stretching overhead like a celestial river. The priests knew each star's position and movement, and they would note how certain constellations rose earlier or later depending on the season. They tracked the phases of the moon, knowing which nights would be bathed in silver light and which would fall into complete darkness. On moonless nights, the stars seemed brighter, sharper, and the priests would use them as markers, tracing invisible lines from one to another to measure time and direction. Venus, brilliant and steady, was a constant companion, sometimes greeting them at dawn, sometimes at dusk, its path a familiar thread woven through their lives. The observatories also played a role in preparing the city for major undertakings. Before the planting of maize, the priests would ensure the chosen day aligned with favorable celestial signs. Before journeys to distant markets or military campaigns, they would consult the sky, seeking assurance from the patterns they trusted. In this way, the observatories influenced decisions that touched every person in the city, from the ruler in his palace to the farmer in his field. Even as political fortunes shifted, the observatories endured, their purpose immune to the ambitions of men. Today, when the wind stirs the trees around these ancient stones, it is possible to imagine the faint echo of footsteps climbing the worn stairs, the low murmur of voices speaking in the soft tones of ritual, the momentary flare of a torch illuminating the carved walls. Though centuries have passed, the sun still rises in the same places, the moon still follows its patient path, and the stars still wheel through the sky in their unchanging dance. The observatories remain as they always were, quiet, steadfast, and endlessly patient, waiting for those who will look up and listen. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the mist lay low over the jungle and the world seemed suspended between night and day, the observatories took on a different life. The air was cool and still. The only sounds the occasional call of a nightbird or the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. The priests would climb the steps slowly, carrying small bundles of tools, their movements deliberate so as not to disturb the fragile peace. They reached the viewing platforms just as the eastern sky began to pale, scanning the horizon for the first light. In those moments, they were both scientists and guardians, keeping watch over the meeting point between earth and sky. The faint glow of dawn would reveal subtle alignments, doorways that framed the point where the sun would rise on this specific date, carved markers that caught the light in a precise and narrow beam. These were not accidents of construction, but the results of generations of careful planning, each stone placed to record the turning of time. When the light touched its appointed mark, the priests would note the moment in their records, satisfied that the cycle remained intact. As the day grew brighter, they might descend to teach their apprentices, sharing the methods by which the heavens could be read, like a vast and intricate book. The teaching was done patiently, for this was not knowledge that could be rushed. Apprentices began by learning the names of the stars and their paths, then moved on to tracking the moon's phases and the shifting position of the sun across the horizon. Only after years of study would they be allowed to take their own measurements and record their findings, adding to the centuries-old legacy preserved in the observatory's walls. At night, the observatories offered an even greater spectacle. The absence of artificial light meant the stars appeared in astonishing clarity, each point of light a familiar companion in the priest's long vigil. They recognized constellations that told stories of gods, animals, and heroes, each woven into the mythology that bound the people together. They followed the movements of bright planets, noting the days when they would draw close to certain stars or vanish behind the glare of the sun. These observations were not idle curiosities. They carried meaning for the timing of ceremonies, for predicting seasonal changes, and for maintaining the balance between the human and the divine. Venus, in particular, was of great importance. Its appearances and disappearances were tracked with unmatched precision, and its cycles were tied to both agriculture and warfare. When Venus returned to the sky after its absence, it was seen as a powerful and sometimes dangerous time, requiring careful ritual to ensure the city's well-being. The observatories were, in this way, tools of both peace and preparation, their stone walls echoing with chants meant to guide the fate of the people. Even centuries later, when the cities fell silent and the jungle began to reclaim its ground, the observatories remained standing, their alignments still true. Vines might drape across their doorways, roots might press against their foundations. But when the solstice came, the sun still poured its light exactly where it had for countless years. The sky did not forget, and neither did the stones. To stand within one today is to feel the weight of that unbroken chain of observation, to imagine the countless dawns and dusks that have passed in silence, each one a link in the great cycle the Maya understood so well. The observatories remain as steady witnesses to time's endless turning, patient as the heavens they were built to watch. As the years passed in the ancient Maya world, the observatories stood like anchors in a sea of change. Cities expanded, rulers rose and fell, alliances shifted, and yet the careful work of tracking the heavens continued without interruption. This constancy was part of their power. For the farmers in the fields, the warriors preparing for distant campaigns, the merchants setting out along trade routes, the assurance that the priest could read the sky brought a quiet sense of stability. The sun would rise where it should, the moon would complete its cycle, and the great planets would return on their appointed paths. Within the observatories, the priests worked with the patience of those who understood that true knowledge is gathered slowly. They knew the importance of each sunrise, each star's appearance, each shadow falling across a carved marker. Every detail mattered. Over decades, these details formed patterns, and the patterns became predictions. Such predictions were not simply announcements, they were events in themselves, moments when the community gathered to witness the accuracy of the priest's work. Imagine the scene at Chichen Itza, when on the spring equinox the afternoon sun cast the shadow of a serpent down the staircase of the Great Pyramid. Though the pyramid itself was not an observatory, the timing of such a display was calculated with the same knowledge used in the round, tower-like structure known as El Caracol. People would watch in hushed awe as the light and shadow moved in perfect unison, believing they were seeing the will of the gods made visible. In the smaller, less grand observatories, scattered across the Maya world, the events were more subtle but no less meaningful. A narrow beam of light might illuminate a glyph carved deep in a wall, visible only for a few moments each year. The moon might rise between two stone pillars, exactly as expected, confirming that the cycles remained intact. These alignments were reminders that the world still turned according to an ancient order, and that the people, through the care of their priests, were in harmony with it. The jungle surrounded these structures, but rather than isolating them, it became part of the experience. At night, the calls of unseen animals formed a backdrop to the glittering sky, their voices rising and falling as the priests took their measurements. The scent of flowers and damp earth hung in the air, mixing with the smoke of copal incense burned in small clay vessels. The atmosphere was one of quiet reverence, the observatories functioning as open-air temples as much as they did as instruments of study. Even when Spanish explorers arrived centuries later, They noted the deliberate alignments and the sophistication of the Maya's celestial knowledge, though they did not fully grasp the cultural depth of what they were seeing. Many observatories fell into ruin in the years that followed, their purpose forgotten by all but a few. Yet the stones kept their secrets, and the sky above them continued its eternal motion. In recent times, archaeologists and astronomers have returned to these sites, confirming what the Maya knew so long ago, that the movements of the heavens can be measured with precision using nothing more than the human eye, careful observation, and the patient passing of years. Standing there now, with modern instruments in hand, researchers find themselves retracing the steps of those ancient priests, looking through the same doorways, watching the same points on the horizon, and realizing that despite the centuries between them, the act of looking up at the sky has changed very little. The observatories still work, still speak, and still mark the turning of time, waiting for those who will listen as the Maya once did. By the time the great cities of the Maya began to wane, the observatories had already recorded centuries of celestial history. These structures had stood through seasons of abundance and famine, through years of peace and moments of conflict, their sightlines and carved markers remaining faithful even as the political landscape shifted. For the priests who still climbed their steps, the work carried a deeper sense of preservation. Each recorded position of a star, each carefully noted solstice, felt like an offering to the future, a way to ensure that the knowledge would survive, even if the city itself did not. In many places, the surrounding jungle began to reclaim the land. Roots pressed between the stones, ferns sprouted from cracks, and the calls of howler monkeys echoed where once the murmur of human voices had filled the air. Yet the observatories endured. Their alignments were untouched by time. The sun still rose in the appointed window. The moon still crossed the horizon where it had for generations. A visitor walking through the ruins today might pause at a narrow opening in the wall, not realizing that it once framed the morning star of Venus on a specific day every 8 years. They might stand in the center of a round chamber, unaware that the angle of the windows above them had been chosen to mark the extremes of the moon's long cycle. These subtleties were the language of the observatories, understood only by those who had devoted their lives to reading them. The passing of the old ways was not sudden. In some regions, the observatories remained in use for years after the peak of the cities had passed, serving smaller communities with the same quiet precision. In others, they fell silent more quickly, the knowledge of their purpose fading as the elders passed on and the younger generations faced new realities. But even without constant human presence, the structures continued to fulfill their design, keeping time with the heavens in silence. The sky, after all, did not depend on human attention to follow its course. In the modern era, when archaeologists began to study these ancient sites, they found themselves struck by the accuracy and intentionality of the alignments. Using advanced equipment, they measured the angles and compared them to the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, discovering that the Maya's observations were astonishingly precise. In some cases, the margins of error were so small that they matched the accuracy of early modern instruments. This was a testament to the patience and dedication of the priests, whose eyes, trained over decades, could detect shifts in light and position with remarkable skill. Today, these observatories have become places where the past and present meet. Tourists walk their steps, guided by local experts who explain the significance of each alignment. Scholars set up modern telescopes alongside ancient sightlines, watching as the same celestial events occur, just as they did hundreds of years ago. The experience is humbling, a reminder that while our tools have changed, our fascination with the sky remains constant. The observatories of the Mayan priests speak to something timeless in the human spirit, the desire to understand our place in the universe, to find patterns in the vastness, to connect the turning of the heavens with the rhythm of life on earth. They stand as stone witnesses to centuries of watching, measuring, and believing. Their purpose is steady and enduring as the stars they were built to follow. In the quiet stillness of the present day, the observatories of the Mayan priests remain as silent echoes of an ancient dialogue between humanity and the cosmos. Weathered by centuries of sun and rain, their stones carry the weight of countless dawns and dusks, each one marking a moment once recorded in careful detail by hands long gone. Standing within these structures now, the air feels different, thicker somehow, as if holding the memory of voices chanting in the soft light of morning, of sandals brushing against the worn steps, of apprentices learning to measure the slow turning of the sky. The jungle has wrapped itself around many of these places, its roots and vines intertwining with the stone, yet the purpose for which they were built is still intact. When the solstice comes, the light still falls precisely where it should. When the equinox arrives, the sun still frames the horizon in perfect alignment. These moments are quiet reminders that time, in its vast and unbroken cycle, still honors the work begun so many centuries ago. For the Maya, the observatories were never mere tools. They were bridges between worlds, places where the earthly and the divine met in the measured glow of sunlight or the steady shimmer of a star. They were spaces of patience and trust, where observation was an act of devotion and knowledge a form of offering. The priests who climbed their heights were not seeking to control the heavens, but to live in harmony with them, to bring the life of their people into rhythm with the great patterns overhead. In a world without clocks, the observatories were time itself, living markers of the year's progression, keepers of the seasons, guardians of the unseen order that governed both crops and kings. Even now, as travelers step carefully across their ancient floors, there is a sense that these places are still watching, still listening to the sky. On clear nights, when the stars blaze in the darkness, and the Milky Way sweeps across the heavens, as it did for the ancient priests, the feeling is almost the same as it must have been then. A mix of wonder, humility, and connection to something far larger than ourselves. Modern instruments can tell us more about the universe than the priests could have imagined, yet the essence of their work remains relevant. They remind us that before data and machines, there was the simple, profound act of looking up, of noticing the way light shifts, the way stars move, the way time reveals itself in patterns, if we are only patient enough to see. The observatories endure as monuments not just to Mayan ingenuity, but to the universal human desire to understand where we are in the vast expanse of existence. In their stone corridors and carefully aligned walls lies a message that transcends centuries. That knowledge and reverence can coexist, that the sky's endless turning is a story we are still part of, and that in watching it, we find a reflection of our own journey through time. And so they stand, silent, steadfast, unyielding, waiting for the next watcher to climb their steps, to gaze through their windows, and to join in the ancient rhythm that has always bound the earth to the stars. That concludes our previous story. Before we begin the next one, I would be grateful if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. And now, we continue with the next chapter in our Boring History for Sleep series, the calligraphers of the Abbasid court. In the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, during an age when Baghdad stood as the shimmering center of the known world, the art of the written word was held in the highest regard. The city, cradled along the banks of the Tigris River, was a place where scholars, poets, and artisans from distant lands gathered beneath the golden domes and shaded courtyards of the Caliphal Palace. Among the most esteemed of those who walked its marble halls were the court calligraphers, men whose skill with the pen elevated writing to a level of beauty and reverence unmatched in their time. The Abbasids ruled over a vast empire, stretching from the western shores of North Africa to the mountains of Persia, and in their court, the preservation and presentation of knowledge was considered a sacred duty. In such a world, calligraphy was far more than decorative art. It was a means of embodying divine truth. The Quran itself was written and copied with exquisite care, each stroke of the pen executed with precision, each letter shaped according to strict rules that preserved both its meaning and its elegance. The calligraphers of the Abbasid court were chosen not only for their steady hands, but for their scholarly understanding of language, proportion, and the geometry hidden within the curves of each letter. Their tools were simple: reed pens cut to exacting angles, ink ground from soot and colored pigments, sheets of polished paper or vellum. But in their hands, these tools produced works that were treasures in their own right. Within the palace, the calligraphers worked in rooms flooded with soft daylight, the air scented faintly with ink, and the polished wood of their desks. Rolls of parchment lay neatly stacked, alongside jars of ink in hues of deep black, warm brown, and occasional flashes of gold or lapis blue for illuminated headings. The sound of a reed pen gliding over the surface was a quiet whisper, broken only by the occasional pause as a scribe examined his work. measuring the spaces between letters, ensuring that each line flowed in harmony with the next. The most skilled calligraphers could spend days on a single page, perfecting the balance of text and ornamentation. They knew that their work would be read not only by their contemporaries, but by future generations, and so they approached each commission with a patience and dedication that made the passing hours irrelevant. Their training had often begun in youth, under the guidance of masters who drilled them in the correct proportions of the aleph, the graceful arc of the mim, the precise joining of letters in flowing scripts like Kufic and Naskh. The Abbasid caliphs valued this work highly, for it reflected the refinement and cultural supremacy of their court. Lavishly copied manuscripts of poetry, history, and science were sent as gifts to foreign rulers, their beauty serving as silent ambassadors of Abbasid sophistication. Within the palace library, one of the most magnificent in the world at the time, these manuscripts were stored alongside works in Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit, translated and preserved for study. The calligraphers were part of this greater mission, their pens linking the wisdom of the past to the curiosity of the present. In the evenings, when the day's light faded and the lamps were lit, the calligraphers would clean their pens carefully, trimming them with knives kept as sharp as a surgeon's tools, and cover their ink to keep it from drying. They would leave their work with a sense of quiet fulfillment, knowing that each page they completed was another thread in the vast tapestry of knowledge and art that defined the Abbasid Golden Age. And though their names were often lost in the margins of history, their work endured, speaking silently of a time when beauty and meaning were written into every line, and when the pen was as much a symbol of power as the sword. Within the grand walls of the Abbasid palace, the work of the calligraphers unfolded like a measured ritual, each day blending seamlessly into the next, marked not by the passing of hours, but by the completion of lines, pages, and volumes. The scribes' chambers were often arranged around open courtyards, where the filtered sunlight would fall gently across their desks, providing steady illumination without glare. In the center of these courtyards, fountains murmured softly, their sound mingling with the near-silent scratch of reed pens. The environment was designed to encourage focus and precision, for the work required an unbroken flow of attention. To create even a single manuscript demanded the collaboration of many skilled hands. One calligrapher might be responsible for transcribing the main text, ensuring each letter was perfectly proportioned and aligned, while another specialist might later embellish the margins with delicate arabesques, geometric patterns, or intricate vine work painted in rich pigments. Gold leaf was applied in careful stages, each flake pressed gently into place with a soft brush until it caught the light like a star set upon the page. The most valued commissions were Quranic manuscripts, and for these the rules were even more exacting. A single smudge or uneven line could mean days of work had to be redone. The scribes would pause often to recite the verses aloud, not only as a spiritual act, but as a way to keep their rhythm steady, allowing the flow of the words to guide the movement of their hands. Their work was not rushed. Time in these chambers was measured in care rather than speed. The training of a court calligrapher was long and demanding. Apprentices began by learning how to prepare their tools, selecting the right reeds, cutting the nib at the correct angle, mixing ink to achieve the perfect consistency and depth of color. They practiced basic letter forms for years before being allowed to copy actual texts. Under the watchful eyes of their masters, they memorized the precise proportions of each script style, the subtle differences in how a letter might be formed in Kufic versus Naskh, and the way these scripts could be adapted for different purposes. The Abbasid caliphs understood the power of such skill. A beautifully crafted manuscript was more than a book. It was a political and cultural statement, a declaration of the sophistication, wealth, and learning of the empire. When foreign envoys visited, they might be shown these works as evidence of the Abbasids' refinement and mastery over both art and knowledge. In some cases, manuscripts were sent as diplomatic gifts, their elegance serving as a form of soft power that could charm as effectively as any treaty. Beyond the palace, the influence of the court calligraphers spread throughout the empire. Their styles were imitated in provincial cities, and their techniques were taught in schools, where the next generation of scribes learned to balance beauty with clarity. In bustling markets, merchants sold less ornate copies of poetry and scholarly works, often modeled on the designs that originated within the palace walls. Yet for all this influence, The life of a calligrapher remained quiet and deliberate. Their work was solitary, their rewards found in the perfection of a line or the flawless joining of two letters. Evenings often ended with the careful storing of tools, pens laid in carved boxes, ink sealed with cloth to keep it from drying, and unfinished pages covered to protect them from dust. As night fell over Baghdad, the city's lights would shimmer in the distance, but within the palace, the scribe's chamber would fall into darkness, leaving behind only the faint scent of ink and the silent testimony of pages completed. It was a life devoted to preserving beauty through discipline, a life where each stroke of the pen was an act of both artistry and devotion, ensuring that the legacy of the Abbasid Golden Age would endure in lines of ink long after the voices of its court had faded. The prestige of being a calligrapher in the Abbasid court was not solely tied to artistic skill. It was bound to an understanding of language, history, and philosophy that elevated the written word beyond mere transcription. The men who held this position were scholars in their own right, capable of discussing the origins of a verse, the meaning of a poet's imagery, or the subtleties of a legal phrase they were tasked with recording. Their work required not only precision of hand, but clarity of mind, for a single misplaced mark could alter the meaning of a sentence. Within the palace, the calligraphers had access to one of the greatest collections of knowledge in the medieval world. The famed House of Wisdom, patronized by the Abbasid caliphs, stood as a beacon of scholarship, attracting translators, mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers from across the empire. Many of these learned men worked closely with the calligraphers, commissioning them to produce copies of newly translated works or to preserve delicate manuscripts brought from distant lands. In this way, the calligraphers were not only artisans, but custodians of knowledge, their steady hands ensuring that wisdom traveled safely through time. The atmosphere in the scriptorium was one of intense concentration. Each scribe sat at a low desk, his tools laid out in precise order, a reed pen sharpened to the ideal angle for the chosen script, a small knife for adjustments, an ink pot with a lid to keep the contents from drying, and a clean sheet of burnished paper smoothed to perfection. The page would be ruled lightly to guide the lines, the spacing calculated so that the text would appear balanced and harmonious. Once begun, the writing flowed in deliberate strokes, the pen's movement almost meditative, each curve and line shaped by years of training. Some calligraphers favored the angular architectural beauty of Kufic script, which lent itself to monumental works and Quranic verses meant to endure for generations. Others specialized in the flowing elegance of Naskh, better suited for long passages of prose or scholarly works. A master could switch between scripts with ease, adjusting the width of his pen or the angle of his strokes to match the style. In the margins of certain manuscripts, small notations might appear, reminders of the text's origin, comments from the scribe about a challenging passage, or even discrete marks indicating where an illuminator should later add gold or color. These side notes were often as revealing as the main text, offering glimpses into the collaborative process behind each finished work. The Abbasid rulers understood the value of their calligraphers and treated them with respect. A particularly skilled scribe might be rewarded with gold, fine garments, or a position of honor within the court. His works could travel far beyond Baghdad, carried by envoys to other capitals, where they would be displayed as proof of the Abbasid Empire's cultural and intellectual supremacy. And yet, for all their prestige, the calligraphers lived lives of quiet discipline. Their satisfaction came not from public recognition, but from the knowledge that they had brought beauty and accuracy to the written word. In the stillness of the night, when the city beyond the palace walls lay sleeping, a calligrapher might unroll a finished manuscript by lamplight, letting his eyes follow the lines from beginning to end. Each stroke would be familiar, yet together they formed something greater than the sum of their parts. A work of art, a vessel of meaning, and a thread connecting his moment in time to all those who had come before and all who would follow. In this way, the calligraphers of the Abbasid court served both their rulers and the vast, unending pursuit of knowledge, leaving behind a legacy that, like the ink on their pages, has endured through the centuries. The daily rhythm of a calligrapher's life in the Abbasid court was as precise and deliberate as the strokes of his pen. Each morning began with the careful preparation of tools, a process that was almost a ritual in itself. The reed pens, or kalam, had to be cut to the perfect angle, the tip shaped according to the script that would be used that day. The ink, often made from soot mixed with gum arabic and water, had to be stirred to the right consistency, sometimes with the addition of rare pigments or even flecks of gold for special commissions. The paper or parchment was smoothed and burnished with a polished stone until it was ready to receive the ink without bleeding. This process was done in silence, for it set the tone for the work that would follow. The scriptorium, often located within the palace or adjacent to the House of Wisdom, was a place of both concentration and quiet beauty. The walls might be lined with shelves holding scrolls, codices, and blank materials, while the windows were positioned to allow in soft, indirect light. The soundscape was gentle, the faint rustle of paper, the soft tap of a pen against an ink pot, the low murmur of a scribe reciting a line to himself before committing it to the page. There was an unspoken understanding that the work being done here was part of something much larger than any individual. Each page completed was a contribution to the intellectual and cultural legacy of the Abbasid Empire. Calligraphers often worked in teams, especially for large or elaborate manuscripts. One might copy the main text, another might prepare headings in larger, more decorative script, and yet another might leave spaces for illuminators to later add geometric patterns, floral motifs, or miniature paintings. Coordination was essential, as a single mistake could disrupt the harmony of the entire page. When an error did occur, it was handled with remarkable skill. Sometimes a thin piece of paper was pasted over the mistake and rewritten so seamlessly that it was almost impossible to detect. For Quranic manuscripts, however, perfection was non-negotiable. Any flawed page would be set aside and redone entirely. The scripts themselves were chosen with great care. Kufic script, with its angular lines and strong geometry, conveyed a sense of permanence and authority, making it ideal for inscriptions and holy texts. Naskh, more rounded and flowing, was better suited for reading aloud, its rhythm lending itself to the recitation of poetry or prose. A master calligrapher knew how to adapt his hand to the demands of each style, ensuring that form and function were always in harmony. Beyond the mechanics of writing, the calligraphers were deeply aware of the symbolic power of their work. In the Abbasid worldview, calligraphy was not merely an art. It was an act of devotion, a way to honor the divine through beauty and precision. The Quran itself referred to the pen as a sacred instrument, and to hold it was to take part in a tradition that reached back to the earliest revelations. The calligraphers approached their craft with humility, knowing that their work would outlive them, carrying their touch and skill into centuries they would never see. In the evenings, after the day's work was complete, the tools would be cleaned and stored with care. The pens were wrapped to protect their tips, the ink sealed to preserve its richness, and the manuscripts covered to guard against dust and damage. As they left the scriptorium, the city of Baghdad would be settling into night, the glow of oil lamps reflecting off the waters of the Tigris. The calligraphers would walk through the palace courtyards, their minds still tracing the elegant curves of letters they had written that day, knowing that tomorrow the work would begin again. Another page, another line, another step in the unending dance between ink and meaning. In the golden age of the Abbasid Caliphate, the calligrapher's craft was not confined to the walls of the palace. Their influence extended across the empire, shaping the visual and cultural language of cities from Damascus to Samarkand. Markets displayed their work in the form of beautifully written poetry, legal documents, and decorative inscriptions on ceramics, textiles, and architectural friezes. The elegance of the court's script styles became a mark of refinement, instantly recognizable and often imitated. Within the court, however, the highest achievements of calligraphy remained closely guarded treasures. Manuscripts created for the caliphs were stored in private libraries, their pages turned only by scholars, poets, or visiting dignitaries. These works were more than books. They were symbols of prestige, their beauty a reflection of the empire's power. Some were presented as gifts to foreign rulers, their delicate lines and gold-illuminated headings speaking a silent language of diplomacy. The making of such a manuscript could take months or even years. The process began with careful planning, the choice of text, the selection of script style, the division of the work among scribes, illuminators, and bookbinders. The pages were prepared in batches, burnished until they gleamed softly in the light, and ruled with faint lines to guide the writing. The lead calligrapher would begin the first page, setting the tone for all that followed. His hand had to be steady, his concentration unbroken, for the first impression was everything. It established the rhythm and style that the rest of the manuscript would echo. In the palace scriptorium, the atmosphere during these projects was a blend of quiet intensity and mutual respect. Apprentices moved carefully between the desks, carrying completed pages to the illuminators or fetching fresh sheets of paper. There was little idle conversation. The work itself was the shared language, each person focused on his part in creating a seamless whole. When gold leaf was applied, it was done in a room shielded from drafts, for even the faintest breath could send the fragile flakes scattering. The illuminators would lay the gold onto an adhesive base, then burnish it with a smooth stone until it caught the light like a sunbeam trapped on the page. Once the calligraphy and decoration were complete, the pages were gathered for binding. Leather covers, sometimes embossed with intricate patterns or inlaid with colored leather, would be fitted around the manuscript, protecting its contents for generations to come. The final product was not simply a book. It was an object of art, intended to inspire awe in all who beheld it. The calligraphers took pride in knowing that their work would travel far beyond their own lifetimes. They imagined scholars in distant centuries opening their pages, running a finger lightly along the lines, and recognizing the mastery of a hand long vanished. In this way, calligraphy became a bridge across time, connecting the moment of its creation to an endless future. At night, when the day's tasks were finished, some calligraphers would remain behind in the quiet scriptorium, working on personal projects, perhaps a copy of a favorite poem or a practice sheet in a new script style. These private works, never intended for the caliph's library, were often where a scribe allowed himself more freedom, experimenting with flourishes or unusual letter shapes. By the light of an oil lamp, the flicker of the flame casting soft shadows across the page, the calligrapher might lose himself in the rhythm of his pen, the outside world forgotten. For him, the art was not only a duty, but a source of peace, a discipline that sharpened the mind and calmed the heart. And so the Abbasid calligraphers, through their patience and devotion, ensured that the beauty of the written word would remain one of the enduring legacies of their age. Beyond the confines of the palace, the work of the Abbasid calligraphers found its way into the very fabric of the empire's daily life. Streets in Baghdad were lined with shops whose signs bore elegant inscriptions, mosques displayed Quranic verses carved into their walls, and marketplaces were decorated with banners written in flowing, confident hands. The beauty of calligraphy was not reserved solely for the elite. It touched the lives of merchants, travelers, and worshippers alike. Yet those who worked within the caliphal court remained the pinnacle of the art, setting the standards by which all others measured their work. Their mastery lay not only in perfecting form, but in preserving meaning. In a culture that revered the written word as a vessel for divine and intellectual truth, accuracy was paramount. A misplaced dot or a poorly formed letter could alter the sense of an entire sentence. For religious texts, such an error was unthinkable, and for legal or diplomatic documents, it could have far-reaching consequences. Thus, the calligraphers approached every commission with the same blend of artistry and responsibility, aware that their pens carried both beauty and authority. The tools of their craft were prepared with as much care as the writing itself. Reeds were selected from riverbanks and cut with precision, their tips shaped to control the flow of ink in the chosen script. Ink was mixed according to closely guarded recipes, some including ingredients like gallnuts, honey, or saffron, to achieve the desired depth of color and texture. The paper or parchment was polished to a fine sheen, sometimes coated with a thin layer of starch to ensure that the ink would sit cleanly on its surface without feathering. Before a major project began, the chief calligrapher would often consult with scholars, poets, or officials to understand the purpose and significance of the text. In this way, the writing became more than a visual arrangement of letters. It became a conscious act of communication, designed to resonate with its intended audience. The calligraphers also acted as custodians of style. Within the Abbasid court, script forms evolved with the times, yet the principles of proportion and balance remained constant. Younger scribes learned from their masters not just how to reproduce letters, but how to feel the rhythm of a script, to understand how the curve of one character should echo the angle of another, how spaces between words could create harmony across a page. This sensitivity to visual balance was what gave Abbasid calligraphy its enduring grace. whether inscribed on a palace wall or copied into a scholar's notebook. On some evenings, the caliph himself might visit the scriptorium to observe the work in progress. Draped in fine robes, he would walk slowly between the desks, pausing to admire a particularly well-formed line or to comment on the richness of a manuscript's illumination. Such visits were both an honor and a subtle reminder of the importance placed on the calligrapher's work. Their craft was not only an art, but a reflection of the empire's identity, its refinement, and its devotion to knowledge. Even today, centuries after the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate, the influence of their calligraphy can be traced across the Islamic world and beyond. The scripts they refined still grace the walls of mosques, the pages of holy books, and the decorative arts of cultures far removed from Baghdad. In the preserved manuscripts that survive, the careful strokes of their pens remain as crisp and deliberate as the day they were written, silent testimony to an age when the beauty of a single letter could speak as powerfully as the finest poetry. The calligraphers of the Abbasid court may have lived quiet, disciplined lives, but through their unwavering dedication, they ensured that their work would endure as long as ink could cling to parchment and the written word could carry meaning across time. The influence of the Abbasid calligraphers reached far beyond the borders of the empire, carried on the pages of manuscripts that traveled with merchants, scholars, and diplomats. These works, meticulously crafted in the palace scriptorium, found their way into the libraries of Cairo, Cordoba, and even as far as the courts of Europe and China. Each manuscript was a silent envoy of Abbasid refinement, embodying the marriage of beauty and intellect that defined the Caliphate's golden age. To those who beheld them in distant lands, the calligraphy was more than elegant writing. It was a glimpse into a culture where the pen was revered as a tool of truth and artistry. Within Baghdad itself, the calligraphers held a place of quiet distinction. They were not warriors or statesmen, yet their work shaped the way the empire was remembered. The laws they transcribed governed cities and provinces. The treaties they recorded sealed alliances. The holy texts they copied guided the faith of millions. Even secular works, poems, histories, scientific treatises, took on an air of permanence when rendered in the flawless lines of a master scribe. In this way, the calligraphers were the silent architects of memory, giving form to the words that would outlast the voices of their age. The environment in which they worked was one of disciplined serenity. Large wooden desks were arranged to catch the best light, and the air carried the subtle scent of ink, vellum, and the polished brass of tools. The soundscape was minimal. The steady whisper of pens on paper, the occasional soft clearing of a throat, the faint creak of a chair as a scribe leaned back to examine his work. The atmosphere encouraged focus, for the task demanded not only technical skill, but mental stillness. A wandering thought could lead to a misplaced stroke, and in a manuscript of hundreds of pages, a single error was an unwelcome intrusion. Apprentices in the scriptorium learned not just the mechanics of calligraphy, but the discipline of patience. They spent hours copying simple lines, repeating the same words until the flow of their hand became as natural as breathing. They learned to hold the pen so that the pressure was consistent, to lift it at precisely the right moment to create a perfect curve or sharp edge. Under the guidance of their masters, they began to see the page not as a collection of letters, but as a balanced composition, where every mark had its place and purpose. Some calligraphers became known for their mastery of a particular script, perhaps the bold authority of Kufic, suited for monumental inscriptions, or the gentle fluidity of Naskh, ideal for continuous reading. Others developed distinctive flourishes or subtle variations that became their signatures, recognizable to those with a trained eye. Though their names were rarely recorded on the manuscripts they produced, their styles lived on, influencing generations of scribes who would never meet them. The Abbasid caliphs valued this legacy and took steps to preserve it. The most treasured works were stored in climate-controlled rooms within the palace, protected from humidity and pests. Some were copied multiple times to ensure their survival, with each copy receiving the same meticulous care as the original. Over time, these collections became vast repositories of human thought, safeguarded by the steady hands of the court calligraphers. Even as political fortunes shifted and the empire faced challenges from within and without, the scriptorium continued its work, a steady heartbeat of cultural continuity. To walk among the desks in those days was to witness history being quietly shaped, not through battles or proclamations, but through the careful shaping of letters, each one a small act of devotion to knowledge, beauty, and truth. The calligraphers of the Abbasid court lived in a world where the value of their work was understood by all who entered the palace. They did not need to raise their voices to be heard, for their influence spoke through the elegant lines that adorned manuscripts, decrees, and inscriptions across the empire. Their craft required a life of discipline, one that began before the sun rose over Baghdad's domes and minarets. In the early hours, when the city was still wrapped in the soft blue of dawn, they prepared their tools in the quiet of their chambers. A reed pen would be examined carefully, its tip adjusted with a small, precise cut. Ink pots would be uncovered, the liquid stirred slowly until it reached the perfect thickness. Sheets of parchment or polished paper would be laid out, their surfaces smoothed until the pen could glide without resistance. This preparation was as much a mental ritual as a physical one, allowing the scribe to enter the state of calm focus needed for the hours ahead. Inside the scriptorium, the day unfolded in measured silence. The chief calligrapher often set the tone, beginning the first lines of a manuscript that others would follow. Each scribe worked in harmony with the next, the text flowing seamlessly from one hand to another, as though written by a single person. When a passage was particularly important, a Quranic verse, a royal decree, or a dedication, it might be set apart in larger script or highlighted with gold leaf. The gold was applied with the lightest touch, the thin sheets pressed into place with a soft brush until they shone like sunlight on water. In addition to their artistic work, the calligraphers were trusted with the recording of state affairs. Treaties, tax records, and correspondence with other rulers passed through their hands, each written with the same precision and care as a holy text. These documents were more than administrative records. They were legal and historical artifacts, meant to endure for generations. The clarity and beauty of the script ensured that the meaning would remain legible and respected long after the events themselves had passed. The relationship between the calligraphers and the scholars of the House of Wisdom was close and mutually beneficial. When a new translation of a Greek philosophical work or a Persian scientific text was completed, it would often be entrusted to the court scribes for preservation. In copying these works, the calligraphers became silent partners in the intellectual achievements of their age, their steady hands ensuring that the ideas of distant lands and long-dead thinkers would continue to live in Baghdad's libraries. Evenings in the palace brought a different kind of light to their work. Oil lamps cast a warm, steady glow over the desks, their flicker softened by glass shades. In this gentle illumination, the gold and rich pigments of the manuscript pages seemed to come alive, their colors deepening as the scribes continued their careful labor. The city outside might be filled with music, the sound of markets winding down, or the calls of storytellers in the streets, but inside the scriptorium there was only the quiet rhythm of pen against paper, an unbroken flow that felt timeless. For the calligraphers, this was more than a profession. It was a calling that demanded humility and dedication, an art form that outlived its creators and spoke on their behalf centuries later. The manuscripts they produced carried the weight of an empire's culture, religion, and identity, preserved not through grand monuments or victories in battle, but through the enduring grace of the written word. In this way, the calligraphers of the Abbasid court became the quiet guardians of history, their legacy inked not in the shifting sands of time, but on pages meant to be read, admired, and remembered for as long as hands could hold a book and eyes could follow a line of script. Over the decades, the calligraphers of the Abbasid court saw their work flow out into the world like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Manuscripts they had crafted with patient devotion traveled along the great trade routes, carried in caravans across deserts and over mountains, shipped along rivers and seas to reach distant lands. In the hands of scholars in Cairo, Cordoba, or Bukhara, these books became both tools of learning and objects of admiration, their carefully formed letters reflecting the standards set in Baghdad. For the calligraphers, knowing that their work was read and studied in faraway places was a quiet source of pride, even if their names were never recorded on the pages. Within the palace, the routine of their work remained steady, untouched by the shifting politics of the empire. Caliphs came and went, dynasties strengthened and weakened, but the scriptorium maintained its steady rhythm. The scribes continued to sharpen their pens each morning, to smooth their parchment, and to shape each letter with the same care as their predecessors had done generations before. There was comfort in this continuity, a sense that their work was part of something eternal, tied to the very cycles of time that the city itself seemed to follow. The calligraphers knew that their craft was a form of preservation. Wars could destroy buildings, fires could consume markets, and rulers could erase the monuments of their rivals, but a well-kept manuscript could endure for centuries, passing through many hands and surviving the changes of fortune. They wrote not for the moment, but for the ages, their lines of ink carrying the voice of a culture across time. On certain days, a calligrapher might be assigned to work on a special commission, a lavish Quran intended for a mosque in a distant province, or a presentation copy of a scientific text meant for a visiting scholar. These projects brought a heightened sense of responsibility, for they were not only functional but ceremonial, intended to represent the Abbasid court at its most refined. The choice of materials would be more luxurious. Parchment of the highest quality, inks tinted with rare pigments, and headings enriched with gold leaf. Every detail, from the spacing of the lines to the pattern of the border, was considered in advance, ensuring a harmony that would please both the eye and the mind. The calligraphers also left their mark on architecture. In Baghdad and other cities of the empire, inscriptions carved in stone or molded into glazed tiles bore the same elegance found on the pages of manuscripts. Passages from the Quran, royal decrees, and poetic verses adorned the walls of mosques, palaces, and public fountains, transforming everyday spaces into expressions of devotion and artistry. Even in the bustling streets, a passerby could look up and read a line that had been designed in the scriptorium, its beauty enduring long after the hand that shaped it had stilled. At night, when the work was put away and the scriptorium fell silent, the calligraphers would sometimes walk the palace grounds, their thoughts still lingering on the day's labor. They might pause beneath an archway where an inscription framed the night sky, the letters illuminated by the moon's glow. In those quiet moments, they could feel the connection between their work and the world beyond, the way their lines of ink were part of a greater design, one that linked earth and heaven, past and future. And though they knew that history would not remember their names, the calligraphers took comfort in knowing that their work would speak for them, carrying their touch and their vision forward into generations yet to come. As the centuries turned and the fortunes of the Abbasid Caliphate began to wane, the calligraphers of the court continued their work with the same quiet devotion that had defined their craft for generations. Outside the palace walls, the world was changing. Trade routes shifted, political powers rose and fell, and distant provinces became more independent. But within the scriptorium, the steady rhythm of pen on parchment endured. The calligraphers understood that their work was not bound to the rise or fall of rulers. It belonged to something greater, to the preservation of words and ideas that would outlast any empire. Even as the city of Baghdad faced challenges, the manuscripts continued to leave the palace, carrying with them the elegance of the scripts perfected over centuries. Some found their way into the libraries of other courts, others into private collections, and many were safeguarded in mosques where they would be read and admired for generations. Those that survived the turbulence of history became precious windows into the past, allowing future scholars to see not only the content of the words, but the artistry of the hands that formed them. For the calligraphers themselves, each day in the scriptorium was an act of faith that the care they invested in a single letter would matter centuries later, faith that beauty had its own form of endurance. Their training, discipline, and mastery of proportion turned each page into a deliberate composition, a balance between the demands of accuracy and the pursuit of elegance. The tools they used remained largely unchanged. The same reeds cut at precise angles, the same inks mixed from soot and natural pigments, the same careful burnishing of paper to create a smooth and receptive surface. In this constancy, they found stability, even as the world beyond the palace gates shifted like sand in the wind. Visitors to the court often remarked on the beauty of the manuscripts they saw, marveling not only at the content, but at the way the script seemed alive on the page, each stroke of the pen carrying both weight and grace. Some envoys returned to their own lands inspired to develop their own traditions of calligraphy, spreading the influence of the Abbasid style far beyond the reach of the caliphate's political power. In this way, the calligraphers became ambassadors of a cultural legacy that transcended borders. By the time the Abbasid era drew to its close, many of the original masters had passed into history, their names remembered only by their apprentices and preserved in the margins of rare manuscripts. Yet their influence was everywhere, in the design of inscriptions on buildings, in the style of writing adopted by scholars, and in the countless pages that still rested in libraries and private collections. The calligraphers had succeeded in their silent mission to make the written word not only a vessel for meaning, but a work of art that could endure the passage of time. Today, when one stands before a manuscript from the Abbasid court, there is a sense of being in the presence of both history and humanity. The ink may have faded slightly, the parchment may be worn at the edges, but the precision and beauty of the script remain intact, as if the scribe had set down his pen only yesterday. Through these works, the calligraphers continue to speak, reminding us that the pen, wielded with skill and devotion, can leave a legacy as enduring as any monument. And so, long after the walls of the Abbasid palaces have crumbled, the calligraphers still keep their silent vigil across the centuries, their work a bridge between the living and the long gone, between the moment a word is written and the endless future in which it can still be read. That concludes our previous story. Before we begin the next one, I would be grateful if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. And now, we continue with the next chapter in our Boring History for Sleep series. What the Inca messengers carried. High in the Andes Mountains, where the air was thin and the peaks rose like jagged guardians over the valleys below, the Inca Empire built a network that bound its vast territories together. From the coastal deserts of what is now Peru to the fertile valleys deep within the mountains and beyond into parts of modern Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, the Inca controlled an expanse of land so varied and rugged that travel could seem almost impossible. Yet they managed to keep their empire connected through a system of roads and runners so efficient that messages could pass from one end to the other in remarkable time. These runners were known as chasquis, and their role was more than that of mere messengers. They were the living pulse of the empire, carrying not only words but vital information, small goods, and even ceremonial items across distances that would challenge even the most skilled travelers today. The roads they traveled were part of the Capacnan, the Great Inca Road, a vast network stretching thousands of kilometers, paved in stone in many places, and marked by carefully placed way stations known as tambos. These tambos served as resting points and supply depots, where a chasqui could hand off his burden to the next runner, ensuring the message continued without pause. A single message could thus travel hundreds of kilometers in a single day, carried from runner to runner in a relay that never stopped. The chasquis were trained from youth, their endurance honed by running the steep, narrow trails that clung to the mountainsides. They were chosen for their speed, strength, and sharp memory, for much of what they carried was not written on paper, but stored in their minds. In a society without a written alphabet, messages were often oral, memorized word for word, and passed along with precision from one chasqui to another. Some messages were accompanied by quipas, bundles of knotted cords whose patterns and colors conveyed numerical data or records of goods. Reading a quipu required special training, and the chasqui were among those trusted to understand and deliver them. What they carried could vary greatly. Some bore orders from the Sapa Inca, the emperor himself, directing the movement of armies or the distribution of food from state storehouses. Others carried reports from provincial governors about harvests, population counts, or the construction of new terraces and irrigation systems. There were also ceremonial deliveries, precious items such as gold ornaments, fine textiles, or offerings for religious rituals. In times of emergency, the chasquis could carry warnings of approaching danger, summoning warriors or alerting communities to prepare. The road was their domain, and they knew every turn, every bridge of woven fibers spanning a roaring river, every pass where the wind could howl so fiercely that it seemed to steal the breath from one's lungs. Running at such altitudes was no easy task. The chasqui relied on lungs accustomed to the thin air, on legs strengthened by years of climbing and descending the mountain paths. They wore light clothing suited to movement and carried small pouches or slings to hold their burdens. Their sandals, made from woven plant fibers, gripped the rocky trails with surprising security. At each tambo, a fresh runner would be waiting, alerted by the sound of a conch shell horn blown by the approaching chasqui. The handoff was quick. A spoken recitation of the message, the passing of the quipu or package, and then the new runner would set off without hesitation, disappearing down the trail while the previous chasqui rested, and prepared for his next run. This system allowed the Inca to move news faster than many empires with more advanced technology, a testament to the discipline and organization that held their realm together. For the Chasqui themselves, the work was both an honor and a responsibility. They carried the lifeblood of the empire in their words and bundles, knowing that the speed and accuracy of their delivery could affect the fate of entire communities. The life of a Chasqui was defined by movement, a constant rhythm of running, resting, and running again, woven into the great fabric of the Inca Empire's communication system. Each Chasqui had his own stretch of road to master, often only a few kilometers in length. Yet he knew it as intimately as a farmer knows his fields. He was familiar with every rise and dip in the trail, every patch of loose stones that could cause a stumble, every bend where the sun lingered or the wind cut sharply through a pass. This knowledge allowed him to move with remarkable speed, conserving energy where the terrain allowed, and pushing hard when the path grew steep or narrow. The tambos, or relay stations, were the lifelines of this network. Positioned at regular intervals along the road, they offered shelter, water, and supplies, and in many cases, a small storage room where goods could be kept until they were needed. Some tambos were simple stone huts, while others were larger complexes capable of housing travelers, officials, and even troops on the move. For the Chasquis, the tambo was where the handoff happened, a brief, practiced exchange where every second mattered. The incoming runner would blow a conch shell or whistle to alert the next Chasqui of his arrival. As soon as the sound reached the ears of the waiting runner, he would be ready, standing in position to receive the message. The moment the two met, the words were passed in quick, clear tones, and the new runner would take off immediately, ensuring that the message continued its journey without pause. The contents of their deliveries varied widely. Some days, a Chasqui might carry nothing more than a verbal update from one official to another. On other days, he might bear a quipu, a series of knotted cords whose arrangement recorded numerical data such as census figures, tribute payments, or military supplies. Interpreting a quipu was a skill in itself, requiring not only familiarity with the types of knots, but also an understanding of the color coding and the spacing between them. The Chasquis entrusted with such items often knew their meaning, but were sworn to keep it confidential, for the information they carried could be sensitive or strategic. The physical demands were relentless. The Inca roads climbed to dizzying heights, crossing mountain passes where the air was thin and cold, then descending into deep valleys where the heat could press heavily on the runner's shoulders. Some stretches of road crossed rope bridges woven from ichu grass, suspended high above roaring rivers. Crossing such a bridge required steady nerves and careful steps, especially when carrying a valuable object that must not be lost. Yet the Chasquis moved with confidence born from training and repetition. From a young age, boys destined to be messengers were trained in running long distances, in breathing techniques to endure the high altitudes, and in the art of memorizing and repeating complex messages word for word without error. Food for the journey was simple and practical: dried maize, chuño, freeze-dried potatoes, and charqui, dried meat, provided sustenance without spoiling. At times, a Chasqui might also carry coca leaves, which when chewed could help stave off fatigue and the effects of altitude. The work was demanding, but it carried prestige. The Chasqui served directly under the authority of the Sapa Inca, and their role was essential to the functioning of the empire. Without them, the flow of information would slow to a crawl, and the coordination of the vast territories would become nearly impossible. For this reason, the Chasquis were respected and well cared for within their communities. They were given shelter and food at the tambos, relief from other forms of labor, and regarded as men who carried the voice of the empire in their steps. And as they ran through the mountains, along the coasts, and across the high plains, they connected distant corners of the Inca world, ensuring that the will of the Sapa Inca could be heard in every village and every valley. The Chasquis were more than just swift runners. They were the veins through which the lifeblood of the Inca Empire flowed, ensuring that every command, every piece of information, and every small but precious object reached its destination without delay. Their work connected the Sapa Inca in Cusco to governors in distant provinces, tied together the coastal cities with the highland fortresses, and allowed the vast network of communities to function as a single, organized whole. The messages they carried were not written letters sealed in wax, as in other empires, but living words stored in memory. A chasqui would receive an order in the form of a carefully rehearsed phrase, sometimes several sentences long, and he would repeat it silently to himself as he ran, ensuring that every word, every detail, remained sharp in his mind. When he reached the next tambo, he would speak it clearly to the waiting runner, who would repeat the process, preserving the message exactly as it had been given. In this way, the spoken word traveled at a speed and with a reliability that would surprise even modern couriers. The road system they traversed was itself a marvel of engineering. The Kapak Nyan wound through some of the most challenging terrain in the world, over steep mountains, across arid deserts, through dense forests, and along sheer cliffs where a single misstep could be fatal. Stone steps were carved into the mountainsides to make the ascent easier, and retaining walls held the path steady against landslides. In flatter regions, the road was wide and level, allowing for faster travel, while in the high mountains it narrowed to a path just wide enough for a man to pass, clinging to the edge of the rock. Rope suspension bridges, woven from grass fibers and renewed each year by local communities, allowed the chasquis to cross deep gorges and rushing rivers. To run across one of these swaying bridges required not only balance, but also trust in the skill of the bridge makers, for beneath the runner's feet lay only a web of woven ropes and, far below, the white water of the river. The chasqui adapted to every challenge the road presented. They could sprint across flat stretches, climb quickly through switchback trails, and descend at speed without losing control. Their lungs were trained to take in enough oxygen even in the thin air of the high Andes, and their legs were conditioned to carry them mile after mile without faltering. They often ran with little more than their sandals, a sling or pouch, and the message they bore, for speed and agility, were everything. Not all of their deliveries were words or quippus. Sometimes the chasquis carried small but critical items: a pouch of coca leaves for a distant noble, a symbolic gift for a ceremony, a sample of a crop from one region sent to the court for inspection, or even fresh fish from the coast carried inland to the mountains, a feat possible only through the unbroken relay of runners. In these cases, the value of what they carried was not measured in size, but in its significance to the recipient. The chasquis also played a role in military organization. When the empire faced threats, the runners could summon troops to gather at strategic points, carry orders for movements, and report on the positions of enemy forces. Their ability to transmit information quickly across great distances gave the Inca a strategic advantage, allowing them to coordinate responses before an opponent could react. In times of peace, their duties were no less important, for they were the ones who kept the threads of administration tied together. They informed the central government of crop yields, labor quotas, and construction progress in far-off regions. In return, they carried the Sapa Inca's commands to distribute stored food in times of famine or to send skilled workers to assist in a major project. Through their constant movement, the chasquis kept the empire alive, their swift feet ensuring that the will of the center reached the edges, and that the voices of the edges returned to the center in turn. The efficiency of the chasqui network relied not only on the endurance of the runners, but also on the careful organization behind them. The Inca administration, known for its precision, placed the tambos at intervals designed to maximize speed without exhausting the messengers. In the lowlands or on level stretches, these stations might be spaced farther apart, allowing a runner to cover greater distances before passing the message along. In the high mountains, where the terrain was steep and the air thin, tambos were placed closer together to ensure that no runner was pushed beyond his limits. Each tambo was staffed and stocked by the surrounding community, which took pride in supporting the messengers. The people who lived near the stations saw it as an honor to provide food, water, and shelter for the chasquis. Their role in maintaining the system was as essential as the runners themselves, for without rest and replenishment, even the fastest courier would falter. This partnership between the runners and the communities along the route ensured that the network could operate continuously, day and night, in all seasons. The roads they traveled were a testament to the Incas' engineering skill. Some were paved with carefully fitted stone slabs that had endured centuries of rain and wind. Others were hardened earth, reinforced with gravel to prevent erosion. In coastal deserts, the roads were marked with lines of stones to guide travelers through the barren landscape, while in the jungle regions, they were raised slightly to keep them above the wet ground. Everywhere, the roads followed the contours of the land, taking the most efficient route possible while avoiding unnecessary hazards. Along these roads, the Chasquis moved like a living thread, weaving together the far-flung provinces into a coherent whole. They carried not only the voice of the Sapa Inca, but also the heartbeat of the empire. A message could leave Cusco in the morning and, through the tireless relay of runners, reach a city hundreds of kilometers away by nightfall. The speed of the system impressed even the Spanish when they first encountered it, marveling at how an empire without horses or wheeled transport could achieve such rapid communication. The Chasqui themselves were men of remarkable stamina and focus. Their training emphasized not just physical ability, but also mental discipline, for they had to remember complex verbal messages and deliver them with exact accuracy. Some messages contained detailed instructions, ceremonial phrases, or diplomatic greetings that could not be altered by even a single word. This meant that a Chasqui's memory had to be as reliable as his legs. The use of quippus added another layer to their work. These knotted cords, often made from cotton or camelid fiber, encoded numerical data and sometimes more abstract information through a system of knots, colors, and spacing. While the primary interpretation of quippus fell to trained specialists called quipucamiocs, the Chasquis needed to understand enough of the system to ensure the cords were handled correctly and delivered to the right person. They also had to guard the quippus from damage during the run, protecting them from rain, dirt, and the strain of travel. The role of the Chasqui was so important that it was considered a specialized service to the empire, exempting them from other forms of labor such as farming or construction. In return, they were provided for by the state, their needs met so that they could devote themselves entirely to their duties. To be chosen as a Chasqui was a mark of honor, signaling that a man possessed both the physical skill and the trustworthiness required for such a position. At the end of each run, when the message had been passed and the new runner had disappeared down the trail, the Chasqui would pause to rest, his breathing slowing as he looked out over the landscape he had just crossed. From the snowy peaks to the deep valleys, from the winding rivers to the terraces carved into the hillsides, the world of the Inca stretched vast and interconnected before him. He was a part of that connection, a vital link in the long chain that kept the empire united. The work of the Chasquis did not follow the slow rhythm of ordinary life in the villages and towns of the Inca Empire. Their days and nights were governed by urgency, for every message they carried was meant to arrive as quickly as possible. The moment a runner reached his designated tambo, the handoff to the next Chasqui happened almost instantly, leaving little time for conversation or rest until the exchange was complete. Only after passing the message would the tired runner allow himself to sit, drink from a gourd of cool water, and take a few mouthfuls of food to restore his strength. This constant readiness meant that the Chasquis were always alert, listening for the distant sound of a conch shell horn, the signal that the next runner was approaching. The horn could carry across valleys and hills, cutting through the wind, giving the waiting Chasqui just enough time to prepare for his sprint. These handoffs were so smooth that the relay rarely lost momentum, even in harsh weather. Rain, snow, or scorching sun might slow a runner's pace, but it did not stop the system from functioning. The Inca Empire depended on this constancy, knowing that without it, the movement of orders, goods, and information would slow and weaken the unity of the realm. The Chasquis were not only carriers of spoken words, but also couriers of objects that could not be entrusted to ordinary travelers. Small pouches of precious stones or gold ornaments might be sent for use in ceremonies. Rolls of fine textiles, woven with intricate patterns and dyed in brilliant colors, could be delivered as diplomatic gifts to regional leaders. Samples of crops from one part of the empire might be sent to the capital for inspection, allowing the Sapa Inca and his advisors to assess harvest quality across the provinces. There were even times when the Chasquis carried fresh goods that would spoil quickly if not delivered in time. Fish from the Pacific coast transported inland to the highlands through an unbroken chain of swift runners. Such feats were possible only because the tambos were positioned so strategically and the relay moved without delay. The training of a Chasqui prepared him for these varied responsibilities. Boys selected for the role practiced running long distances with weighted pouches to build strength. They learned to navigate every type of terrain they might encounter: slippery mountain paths, narrow cliffside trails, sandy desert tracks, and rope bridges that swayed with each step. They also practiced memorizing complex messages, sometimes using rhythmic patterns or repetition to ensure nothing was forgotten in the transfer. A skilled chaski could repeat a message verbatim after running for many minutes at full speed, his mind as sharp as his legs were strong. The respect given to these men was clear in how communities treated them. When a chaski passed through a village, people would make way for him, recognizing the importance of his task. At the tambos, they were provided with food, coca leaves to chew for stamina, and sometimes a place to rest if their shift had ended. In exchange, the chaskis were expected to uphold the highest standards of discipline. They could not delay their run for personal reasons, nor could they reveal the contents of sensitive messages. Their loyalty was to the empire, and breaking that trust would bring dishonor to themselves and their families. In the eyes of the Sapa Inca and his officials, the chaskis embodied the empire's efficiency and order. They were the invisible force holding together a realm that stretched across mountains, deserts, and forests, making it possible for distant regions to act in harmony. Even centuries later, the stories of their speed, endurance, and dedication would be remembered as one of the great achievements of the Inca civilization, proof that communication, when organized with skill and care, could be as powerful as any army. The chaski network was as much a reflection of the Inca worldview as it was a practical tool of governance. The empire was built on the principle of reciprocity, Aini, where every person, community, and province contributed to the whole and in return received the benefits of unity and protection. The chaskis were a living embodiment of this principle, giving their strength and skill to serve the collective needs of the realm. Their presence on the roads was constant, a sign that the empire was alive and connected from one end to the other. The routes they ran formed a web of stone and earth across the Andean landscape. In some places, the roads wound gently through valleys, lined with terraced fields and dotted with villages where farmers tended maize, potatoes, and quinoa. In other regions, the path climbed sharply into the thin air of the mountains, where the ground was bare rock and the wind cut through with icy precision. Along the Pacific coast, the roads ran through deserts where the heat shimmered off the ground and water was scarce, making the tambos in those regions critical lifelines for any traveler. No matter the environment, the chaskis adapted their pace and breathing to the conditions, always focused on their destination. The tambos themselves varied in size and complexity. In remote highland passes, a tambo might be little more than a single stone shelter stocked with dried food and water. In more populated areas, they could be large compounds with multiple rooms, storage facilities, and space for officials or troops traveling along the road. Each was maintained by local communities who took turns ensuring that supplies were replenished and repairs made. This system of shared responsibility ensured that the chaski network could function year-round, even during the heavy rains or the bitter cold of winter at high altitudes. The handoff between runners remained one of the most impressive aspects of the system. The moment the approaching runner's conch shell call echoed through the air, the next chaski would be ready, muscles tense and eyes focused on the trail ahead. As the two met, the message, whether spoken, contained in a quipu, or carried in a small pouch, was passed instantly, along with any necessary instructions or clarifications. Then the new runner would sprint off, disappearing into the landscape while the first caught his breath and recovered. This seamless relay was what gave the Inca their remarkable speed of communication, often outpacing empires that relied on horses. The information carried was as varied as the empire itself. It could be a royal decree instructing a distant province to send workers for a new agricultural terrace, an order for the redistribution of food from state storehouses after a poor harvest, or news of an enemy force spotted near the borders. It could also be a ceremonial item for an upcoming festival, an urgent request for a healer to travel to a remote community, or even something as simple as a report of the weather in a particular valley. Whatever the content, the chaski was expected to deliver it with absolute accuracy and speed. Their endurance was legendary. Many could cover their assigned segment in minutes, even when the path was steep and uneven. They ran with an economy of motion, their strides long and steady, their breathing controlled despite the demands of the high-altitude terrain. To the untrained eye, it might seem impossible for such speed to be maintained over such distances. But for the chaskis, this was the result of years of preparation and a lifetime spent on the trails. Even after the Spanish conquest, travelers marveled at the remnants of this network and the skill of the runners who had once animated it. Though the empire that sustained them eventually fell, the story of the Chaskis endured as one of the great feats of human organization and endurance, a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, with no wheels or beasts of burden, the power of the human body and will could carry the voice of an entire nation across mountains, rivers, and time itself. In the heart of the Inca communication system, the Chasqui represented an unbroken chain of trust, discipline, and precision. They did not merely carry messages, they carried the expectations of the Sapa Inca himself, the stability of the empire, and the delicate balance between its many diverse regions. Each runner understood that a delay, a forgotten word, or the loss of a small but vital object could have consequences that rippled far beyond his own stretch of road. This sense of duty gave their work a quiet gravity, one that shaped every decision they made during their runs. The routes they followed often led through landscapes of breathtaking beauty and daunting challenge. At dawn, a Chasqui might start his run with the first light billing over snow-capped peaks, casting long shadows across valleys filled with morning mist. By midday, he could be running under a blazing sun in an arid plain, the ground hard and dry beneath his sandals. By evening, he might be ascending a narrow trail cut into a mountainside, the air growing colder and thinner with each step. These constant shifts in environment demanded a remarkable adaptability. Each change in climate, altitude, or terrain required a subtle adjustment to breathing, stride, and pace. Along the way, the Chasquis relied on their deep knowledge of the road and the tambos that dotted its length. They knew which stations had the sweetest water, which offered the best shelter from the wind, and which were positioned before a particularly grueling climb where extra rest might be needed. At each stop, the routine never varied. The sound of the conch shell to announce arrival, the swift exchange of message or cargo, and the immediate departure of the fresh runner. The departing Chasqui would then take his turn to recover, chewing coca leaves to ease fatigue, drinking water to rehydrate, and eating small portions of dried maize or chuño to restore energy. The contents of what they carried often reflected the priorities of the empire at that moment. In times of political tension, the Chasquis might be almost entirely occupied with relaying orders to mobilize troops or to coordinate defenses along the frontiers. In seasons of abundance, they might carry news of successful harvests, records of stored surplus, and instructions for distributing food to areas in need. During religious festivals, they might bear sacred objects or special garments to be used in ceremonies. Their pace no less urgent despite the absence of military or political crisis. The Chasqui also contributed to the empire's ability to respond to natural events. Reports of landslides, floods, or earthquakes could be sent rapidly to Cusco, allowing the central authorities to dispatch aid and resources where they were needed. In this way, the runners served not only as messengers of command, but as channels of information that helped maintain the welfare of the people. Their value was recognized in ways both practical and symbolic. They were excused from heavy agricultural labor and granted a respected position within their communities. They trained alongside other chosen youths, developing not only physical strength, but mental resilience and sharp memory. Older Chasquis passed down techniques for conserving energy on steep climbs, for reading weather signs in the mountains, and for maintaining focus when fatigue threatened to dull the mind. Even after years of service, a skilled Chasqui often remembered the exact contours of his route, the distances between landmarks, and the faces of those who awaited him at each tambo. With each completed run, they added another thread to the vast web of connections that kept the Inca Empire united. And though their work left no grand monuments of stone, the system they sustained was a monument in itself, one built of endurance, coordination, and the unwavering rhythm of human footsteps carrying the voice of a nation across the spine of South America. As the Chasqui ran their appointed stretches, they were more than solitary figures on lonely roads. They were part of a living network that pulsed with constant motion. At any given moment across the vast Inca Empire, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of runners were on the move, each one carrying a fragment of the empire's voice. The system's efficiency depended on the absolute reliability of each link, for if one runner failed, the chain could break, and a message might arrive too late to be of use. This was why the Chasqui were chosen with such care and trained with such rigor. They had to be swift and tireless, but they also had to be trustworthy beyond question, for much of what they carried was confidential and vital to the functioning of the state. The roads they traveled were engineered to endure the weight of centuries, built with an understanding of the land's challenges. In the high Andes, the roads often clung to sheer cliffs, supported by retaining walls that kept them from collapsing under the strain of gravity and weather. In the lowlands, causeways lifted the paths above marshy ground, ensuring that the runners' feet stayed dry and their pace uninterrupted. Bridges of woven fiber linked cliffsides across roaring gorges, and stone stairways climbed impossible slopes with a precision that allowed the chasqui to move swiftly and safely. The tambos, spaced like beads along these roads, were more than rest stops. They were the nerve centers of the system. Each one was strategically placed to allow the handoff between runners to happen without delay, and each was stocked with supplies to sustain both the chasquis and other travelers. A tambo keeper, often a member of the local community, maintained the station and ensured that a fresh runner was always ready when the call of the conch shell signaled an arrival. These keepers, though not runners themselves, were essential to the smooth operation of the network, providing the support that kept the messengers moving day and night. The messages varied in urgency, and the chasquis adapted their pace accordingly. A ceremonial delivery might allow for a steady, sustainable speed, while news of a military threat would demand an all-out sprint for every runner in the chain. Even in emergencies, however, the precision of the handoff was never sacrificed. Clarity and accuracy of the message remained as important as speed. The chasquis relied on memory techniques to preserve spoken messages, word for word. Some repeated the phrases in rhythm with their strides. Others divided the message into sections, mentally attaching each part to a landmark along their route. When quipus were involved, the cords were handled with the utmost care, protected from rain and dirt in small pouches carried close to the body. These knotted records, unreadable to the untrained eye, could contain complex data, tax records, military counts, or inventories of goods, and their safe delivery was as critical as that of any royal command. In the quiet moments between runs, a chasqui might rest in the shade of a tambo wall, looking out over the landscape he had just crossed. He might see the winding ribbon of road stretching into the distance, dotted with the faint figures of other travelers, and know that somewhere ahead, another runner was already moving toward him with a message of his own. This unending flow gave the empire a sense of unity, binding together places separated by mountains, rivers, and vast distances. It was a system that required no wheels, no beasts of burden, only the disciplined strength of the human body and the shared commitment of communities across the empire. In this way, the chasquis embodied the very spirit of the Inca state, efficient, coordinated, and deeply connected to the land they served. The chasqui system was not simply a means of moving information. It was a living example of the Inca Empire's capacity for coordination across vast and unforgiving landscapes. Every runner, every tambo, every stretch of road was part of a design that reflected both practicality and vision. From the snowbound peaks where condors wheeled overhead to the sun-baked coastal plains where the horizon shimmered with heat, the network functioned with the same steady rhythm, day after day, year after year. Messages flowed through it like water through an aqueduct, directed with precision to their intended destinations. The chasquis understood that their service was as vital in times of peace as it was in war. During peaceful seasons, they carried records of harvests, census counts, and labor contributions, ensuring that the Sapa Inca's administrators in Cusco had an accurate picture of the empire's resources. They transported instructions for public works, new roads, agricultural terraces, or irrigation channels, and carried back reports of their progress. In times of celebration, they were the bearers of ceremonial gifts and sacred objects, moving these items swiftly to the sites of festivals so that no ritual would be delayed. In times of crisis, their role became even more urgent. News of a failed harvest in one province, a sudden illness affecting a governor, or the sighting of enemy scouts near the border could be relayed to Cusco in astonishingly short order. The rapid transmission of such information allowed the central government to act quickly, dispatching aid, sending healers, or mobilizing troops. Without the chasqui, these responses would have been slower, less coordinated, and perhaps less effective in maintaining the stability of the realm. The discipline of the chasqui was remarkable. They maintained their routes regardless of weather, running through snow that numbed the feet, rain that turned the path slick, and sun that burned the skin. Their sandals were often replaced, worn thin by the endless miles. They learned to breathe deeply and evenly in the high altitudes, to descend steep trails without stumbling, and to cross swinging rope bridges without losing balance. Each runner was attuned to his own body, knowing exactly how much energy he could spend before the next tambo, where water or rest awaited. The tambos themselves stood as the silent witnesses of countless handoffs. Their stone walls sheltered runners from storms. Their storerooms held the dried maize and chuño that kept the messengers fed, and their watch points allowed lookouts to spot approaching chasqui from a distance. The keepers of these stations played their own essential role, ensuring that the next runner was ready when the call of the conch shell echoed through the air. In many ways, these keepers were the unsung partners in the system, just as essential as the runners themselves. For the people of the empire, the sight of a chasqui on the road was a reminder that they were part of something larger. Even in remote mountain villages or isolated valleys, the arrival of a runner meant connection to the capital, to other regions, and to the ruler whose authority stretched across so many different landscapes and peoples. The chasqui did not speak of their own importance, yet they must have known that without them, the unity of the empire would be far harder to maintain. In their swift, silent journeys, they stitched together a realm that might otherwise have been fragmented by distance. It was a role of quiet honor, and one that left an enduring mark on the history of the Andes. As the empire moved through the final chapters of its history, the chasquis continued to run, their footsteps a steady rhythm against the stones of the Capacñan. Even in times of uncertainty, when political tensions rose or distant provinces murmured with unrest, the messengers carried on as they always had, passing words and orders with the same precision that had bound the Inca world together for generations. Their work was not interrupted by the winds of change. The empire's communication network remained intact until the very end, a testament to the discipline and dedication of those who ran it. Each chasqui's journey began and ended countless times over the course of a single day, but every segment was part of something far greater than himself. A runner leaving a tambo might not know the full importance of what he carried: a short command, a knotted quipu, a pouch of ceremonial coca leaves, but he knew that it was needed elsewhere, and that getting it there quickly and accurately was his duty. In that moment, the runner was the empire's voice and hands, bridging the distance between the Sapa Inca's will and the farthest reaches of the Andean world. The terrain never ceased to challenge them. They moved over jagged passes where the air was thin, and the sky seemed impossibly close, along desert paths where heat shimmered off the earth, and through deep valleys where rivers carved their way through ancient rock. They crossed rope bridges swaying above roaring waters, climbed stairways carved into sheer cliffs, and sprinted across high plains under an endless blue sky. Each step was taken with purpose, each breath measured to conserve energy for the miles ahead. What they carried was not always measured in weight, but in value. The smallest quipu could hold records of tribute, population counts, or military readiness. A tiny pouch could contain seeds from a distant province, destined for planting in a new region. A memorized message could change the movement of armies or the timing of a festival that united thousands of people. These runners held in their minds and hands the strands of the empire's order, their reliability ensuring that those strands did not fray. When the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, they were astonished at the speed of this communication system. They found it difficult to believe that messages could move faster across mountains on foot than by horse on the plains of Europe. Yet the chasqui had proven it daily for centuries. The conquistadors disrupted the network as they took control, but remnants of it persisted, and the roads themselves endured, used by local communities long after the empire fell. In time, the role of the chasqui faded into history, yet it left behind a legacy carried in the stories of Andean peoples and in the very stones of the road they once ran. Even today, travelers who walk along the preserved stretches of the Capacñan can imagine the distant sound of a conch shell echoing through the valleys, the quick exchange of words as one runner handed off to another, and the blur of a figure disappearing down the path toward the horizon. The tambos, though weathered by centuries, still stand in some places as silent witnesses to the system they served, their walls remembering the countless arrivals and departures that once passed through their doors. The chasqui were not kings or generals, yet without them, the empire could not have functioned as it did. Their endurance, loyalty, and precision made them as vital as any army, as essential as the terraces that fed the people or the engineers who built the roads. They proved that the true strength of the Inca Empire lay not only in its grand architecture or its vast resources, but in the coordination of countless individuals, each fulfilling a role with unwavering commitment. In this way, the Chasquis remain a symbol of unity and perseverance, a reminder that even the most powerful empires are held together by the countless tireless efforts of those whose names may never be remembered, but whose work ensured that the heart of the nation never stopped beating. That brings us to the end of our previous story. Before we begin the next one, I'd be grateful if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. And now, let us continue with the next chapter in our Boring History for Sleep series, as we journey to the weaver's workshop in ancient Mesopotamia. In the heart of ancient Mesopotamian cities, where narrow streets wound between mud brick houses and the scent of baked clay lingered in the air, there existed places of quiet yet constant industry, workshops where weavers labored at their looms from dawn until the last light faded from the sky. The sound within these rooms was rhythmic, steady, and almost hypnotic. The soft clack of wooden frames, the shuffle of feet adjusting positions, and the whisper of threads sliding against each other. These workshops were not bustling markets or grand temples, but they were essential to the life of the city. For it was here that garments, tapestries, and textiles of every kind were brought into being. The Mesopotamians, living between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, understood the value of cloth not merely as something to wear, but as a symbol of wealth, trade, and cultural identity. Each city had its own preferred styles, patterns, and techniques, and the best weaving houses were known by reputation far beyond their walls. Some served the households of wealthy merchants and officials, producing intricate garments woven with dyed threads in deep blues from imported lapis pigments or soft reds from madder roots. Others made sturdy, practical cloth for farmers and laborers, using undyed wool or linen to withstand the demands of daily life. Inside the workshop, the air was heavy with the faint, earthy scent of raw fibers. Bundles of wool, freshly sheared from sheep raised on the fertile plains, were sorted by texture and color. Spindles of spun thread sat neatly in baskets, ready to be drawn across the loom. The warp threads were stretched tight, vertical lines that formed the foundation of each piece, while the weft threads were skillfully passed back and forth, building the fabric row by row. Weavers' hands moved with practiced ease, their fingers knowing each motion so well that their eyes could wander to conversation or observation without losing the pattern. The work was demanding, yet it had its own quiet pace, slow enough to allow precision, fast enough to keep up with orders from patrons who expected timely delivery. Apprentices, often young girls or boys from nearby families, learned by watching the masters, first practicing on small scraps before being trusted with larger, more valuable cloths. They began with the simplest tasks, winding thread onto spools, preparing the dyes, or adjusting the tension of the loom. Over months and years, they absorbed the subtle knowledge of their elders, how to recognize the right moment to shift a thread, how to feel for the perfect tightness without needing to measure, how to see a mistake in a pattern before it became too large to fix. The dyeing process, though often done in separate workshops, was an art closely tied to weaving. Dyed threads brought vibrancy and variety to the fabrics, and the richest colors were a sign of prestige. Indigo, prized for its deep, lasting blue, was expensive to produce, while bright yellows came from saffron or pomegranate rind, and shades of red were drawn from roots and insects. Each color had to be prepared carefully so it would not fade with the washing or the passing of seasons. When these dyed threads found their way to the looms, the results could be breathtaking. Patterns that imitated the rippling of water, the rising of the sun, or the orderly rows of crops in the fields. These designs were not only decorative but often symbolic, reflecting religious beliefs, seasonal cycles, or the identity of the family who commissioned the work. The weaving houses of Mesopotamia were also places of trade and negotiation. Merchants would arrive to place orders or inspect finished goods, haggling over prices and delivery dates. Some cloth was destined for local use, while other pieces would be loaded onto caravans, bound for distant cities. In a land where rivers were the lifeblood of commerce, bolts of fine fabric could travel as far as the Levant or the Persian Gulf, carrying with them the skill and artistry of the Mesopotamian weaver. And so within those quiet walls, day after day, the steady rhythm of the loom continued, a sound as constant as the flow of the rivers outside, weaving not just threads, but the very fabric of Mesopotamian society. Beyond the walls of the weaving house, the life of the Mesopotamian city moved at its own bustling pace. But inside, time seemed to stretch in a different way. The work of weaving could not be rushed without risking mistakes, and so the hours were filled with deliberate, steady motion. The master weaver, often a respected elder with decades of experience, oversaw every aspect of production. His or her eyes could instantly spot a thread that was slightly out of place, a tension that was too loose, or a die that had not set properly. While the apprentices worked at their own stations, the master would walk slowly between the looms, offering quiet corrections or demonstrating a particular motion with patient hands. The looms themselves were remarkable tools, simple in their construction yet capable of producing fabrics of extraordinary beauty and complexity. Made from sturdy wood, they stood anchored to the packed earth floor, their vertical frames supporting the taut warp threads. The weaver sat or stood before them, passing the shuttle through the gap in the warp, then pressing the weft into place with a comb-like beater. Each pass was accompanied by a soft thud as the fabric grew, inch by inch, into something tangible and whole. It could take days, even weeks, to complete a single length of fine cloth, especially if the pattern was intricate. The patterns were not random. Many had been passed down through generations, carrying with them meaning and memory. Geometric shapes might represent the order of the cosmos. Zigzag lines could symbolize rivers or protective forces, while repeating diamonds might stand for fertility and abundance. These motifs were not just decoration. They were a silent language, one that could be read by those who understood the traditions. A wealthy merchant commissioning a cloak might choose symbols that reflected his prosperity, while a family ordering a wedding garment might request patterns meant to bless the union with harmony and many children. The social role of weaving in Mesopotamia was as important as its economic one. Women, in particular, were closely associated with textile production, though men were not absent from the craft. In some households, weaving was a domestic activity carried out by female family members, but the larger workshops often employed both men and women, each contributing their skills to the communal effort. The wages varied depending on skill, speed, and the type of cloth produced. The most talented weavers could earn enough to support their families comfortably, while apprentices earned little but gained the priceless gift of mastery over time. Around midday, the rhythm of work would pause for a short rest. Workers shared simple meals, flatbread baked that morning, cheese, olives, or dates, sitting together on low stools or woven mats. Conversations flowed quietly, sometimes about the progress of a commission, other times about family news or events in the city. These moments of rest were brief, for the looms called them back, and orders waited to be completed. The relationship between weaver and patron was built on trust. A patron expected not only quality, but also reliability, and a workshop that failed to deliver on time risked losing its clientele. For this reason, the master kept careful track of each project, ensuring that the work moved forward without unnecessary delay. Merchants might stop by unannounced to check on their orders, and it was customary to show them the work in progress, allowing them to see the threads slowly forming into the promised design. In the broader economy of Mesopotamia, textiles were not just commodities, but also a form of wealth in themselves. Bolts of fine cloth could be used as payment for goods, services, or even as offerings to temples. Religious institutions, in fact, often had their own weaving workshops, producing garments for priests, ritual cloths for ceremonies, or banners to hang in sacred spaces. In such settings, the weaving was accompanied by prayer or ritual observance, and the patterns chosen might carry deep spiritual significance. As the day in the workshop drew toward its end, the light from the small high windows softened to gold, and the shadows lengthened across the floor. Threads were secured, tools were set aside, and looms stood silent until the next morning. Outside, the city might be preparing for markets or evening gatherings, but the weavers left their work knowing that the next day would bring the same steady rhythm, the same quiet labor that had sustained their people for generations. In the long history of Mesopotamia, where empires rose and fell and rulers came and went, the weaving houses remained constant, weaving not just the garments of their time, but also the enduring story of human skill, patience, and artistry. The reach of Mesopotamian weaving extended far beyond the walls of the workshop and the boundaries of the city. The cloth produced here was more than a local necessity. It was a valuable commodity sought after across regions, traveling along the trade routes that crisscrossed the ancient world. Merchants loaded bolts of fabric onto the backs of donkeys or into riverboats that glided along the Euphrates and Tigris, carrying them to markets in distant towns and trading posts where the sound of foreign tongues filled the air. These trade networks connected the Mesopotamian city-states to lands as far as Anatolia, the Levant, and the Persian plateau, bringing not only goods but also ideas and influences. A bolt of finely woven wool from Mesopotamia could be exchanged for precious metals, spices, or timber from Lahab, lands where such materials were abundant, but cloth of such quality was rare. In this way, the work of the weavers became a silent ambassador for their culture, representing the skill, discipline, and artistry of their homeland to people who might never set foot in the Mesopotamian plains. The merchants who dealt in textiles were often shrewd negotiators, aware that the cloth they carried had value beyond its practical use. They knew how to highlight the fineness of the weave, the rarity of certain dyes, and the cultural meaning embedded in the patterns. In markets far from home, a robe woven with intricate designs could be seen as an exotic treasure, fetching prices that made the long journey worthwhile. This high demand encouraged workshops to push for even greater refinement, developing techniques to produce lighter, softer fabrics, or more complex patterns that could catch the eye of a wealthy foreign buyer. The influence was not one way. As merchants returned from their travels, they brought with them new patterns, new dyes, and new weaving methods they had seen elsewhere. These were sometimes adapted into local styles, leading to a slow evolution in design that reflected both tradition and innovation. A Mesopotamian workshop might begin to incorporate a motif popular in Anatolia or experiment with a deep indigo dye from the eastern lands. The result was a textile culture that, while deeply rooted in its own history, remained responsive to the world beyond. Temples and palaces often played a role in these exchanges. As major centers of wealth and power, they commissioned large quantities of cloth, not only for use in ceremonies and official functions, but also as diplomatic gifts. A visiting ruler might be presented with a length of the finest fabric as a gesture of goodwill, knowing that such a gift would be treasured. In these contexts, the work of the weavers became part of the fabric of political life, their skills serving the purposes of statecraft, as well as commerce. The logistics of textile trade were themselves an intricate art. Cloth had to be measured and cut precisely to meet the expectations of foreign buyers. It had to be packed in ways that protected it from moisture, dust, and insects during long journeys. Merchants often traveled in caravans for safety, their goods guarded against bandits who knew the value of the cargo they carried. River transport was swifter, but came with its own dangers: sudden floods, shifting channels, and the risk of loss if a boat capsized. The risks were balanced by the rewards. For the workshop, a successful trade relationship could mean steady orders for months or even years. The master weaver might set aside certain looms exclusively for work destined for foreign markets, trusting only the most skilled hands with these prestigious commissions. The apprentices learned from such projects, their own understanding of the craft deepening as they handled patterns and materials meant for distant lands. In time, some of these apprentices would travel themselves, accompanying merchants to oversee the presentation and sale of their work. They would see firsthand the faces of those who marveled at the smooth texture of a Mesopotamian cloth, or traced their fingers over the fine lines of its patterns. Such moments reinforced the knowledge that what they created in the quiet of the workshop had a life far beyond their own city, becoming part of other people's daily lives, celebrations, and traditions. This interweaving of cultures, economies, and human stories was as much a product of the loom as the cloth itself. Each bolt of fabric carried with it not only the labor of the weaver, but also the history of the land, the flow of the rivers, the trade winds across deserts, and the enduring human desire to create beauty that could be touched and worn. Within the heart of Mesopotamian society, textiles held a place of significance far beyond their practical function, woven deeply into the symbolic and ceremonial life of the cities. In temples dedicated to gods such as Ishtar, Enlil, and Marduk, bolts of finely woven cloth were offered as gifts, draped over statues of deities, or used to adorn sacred spaces during important festivals. The choice of colors, patterns, and materials in these offerings was deliberate, each aspect carrying layers of meaning understood by both priest and layperson. Deep crimson might symbolize vitality and divine favor, while pure white could represent spiritual purity or a plea for forgiveness. Gold threads, when available, added a sense of radiance intended to honor the gods themselves, shimmering in torchlight or the glow of the sun streaming into temple courtyards. Ceremonies were occasions for textiles to speak without words. During the Akitu festival, a major New Year celebration, priests in attendance wore garments specially woven for the occasion, their patterns chosen to align with the festival's themes of renewal and cosmic order. These clothes were not worn again for ordinary life. Once their ceremonial role was fulfilled, they might be stored as sacred items or cut into smaller pieces to be distributed among the faithful as blessed relics. Royalty, too, relied on the art of the weaver to project power, legitimacy, and divine connection. Kings and queens were often depicted in reliefs, wearing garments of extraordinary detail, layered robes with repeating motifs that symbolized fertility, strength, or the favor of the gods. Such garments were not simply decorative. They were tools of statecraft, subtly reminding subjects and foreign envoys alike of the ruler's wealth and influence. To wear a robe of unparalleled fineness was to embody the prosperity of the kingdom itself. In some cases, rulers commissioned entirely new patterns to mark significant victories, alliances, or building projects, ensuring that their reign would be remembered not only through inscriptions on clay tablets, but also in the living memory of designs worn at court. Temples often employed their own weaving workshops, separate from commercial enterprises, where textiles were produced solely for religious purposes. These temple weavers worked under strict supervision, following prescribed designs that had been passed down through generations, with little room for improvisation. The process was itself a form of devotion, each careful motion of the shuttle an act of service to the divine. The apprentices in these sacred workshops learned to treat the loom not just as a tool, but as a conduit between the human and the divine realms. In civic life, important events such as weddings, treaties, and coronations also called for special garments. A bride might wear a robe woven with patterns invoking fertility and prosperity, while envoys concluding a peace agreement could exchange garments as a sign of mutual respect and trust. In these contexts, textiles became a language of diplomacy, their textures and designs carrying messages of goodwill that transcended spoken words. Public festivals were vibrant displays of the weaver's art, where the streets came alive with color. Citizens donned their best garments, often saved or borrowed for the occasion, transforming the city into a moving tapestry of patterns and hues. The workshop's reputation could rise dramatically if its work was seen on the shoulders of influential figures during these events. A single robe, admired and discussed, might bring in orders for years to come. Even in death, textiles played an essential role. Burial shrouds were often carefully chosen or specially woven, intended to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. For the wealthy, these might be as richly decorated as the garments worn in life, a final statement of status and care. For ordinary citizens, a well-made shroud was a sign of dignity, a last gift from family to loved one. The symbolic power of textiles lay in their ability to touch all aspects of life, from the sacred to the political, from public celebration to private mourning. Every thread carried not only the skill of the weaver, but the values, beliefs, and aspirations of the society that commissioned it. In this way, the weaver's workshop was as much a participant in the city's spiritual and cultural life as the temple or the palace, shaping the visual and emotional landscape of Mesopotamia one loom's length at a time. Life inside a Mesopotamian weaving workshop unfolded at a rhythm both steady and demanding, shaped by the turning of seasons, the flow of trade, and the unyielding expectations of patrons. The day began before sunrise, when the streets of the city were still cloaked in the soft blue haze of dawn. Weavers, apprentices, and assistants arrived quietly, some carrying bundles of wool or baskets of flax, others clutching clay cups of warm barley drink to steel themselves against the cool morning air. In the dim light, the workshop was a place of muted activity. The looms, tall and imposing, stood like silent sentinels against the walls, their wooden frames smelling faintly of oil and age. As the first rays of the sun filtered through narrow windows, the space came alive with the soft thrum of work. Warp threads were checked for tension, spindles refilled with yarn, and dyed fibers laid out in careful order. Experienced weavers moved with unhurried precision, their hands finding the rhythm of the shuttle as naturally as breathing. Apprentices, often the children of weavers or those from families seeking a trade for their sons and daughters, began the day with simpler tasks: winding thread, carding wool, or learning to tie the small knots that secured the warp. The journey from apprentice to master was long, often spanning years, and required patience as well as skill. The first lessons were not in weaving patterns but in discipline: how to sit for hours without losing focus, how to listen to the subtle creak of the loom, and how to read the fabric as it emerged, spotting even the smallest mistake before it spread across the cloth. Meals were taken communally, often consisting of bread, cheese, dried dates, and watered beer, eaten in the shade of the workshop courtyard. These breaks were moments of shared stories, tales of market gossip, news from traveling merchants, and sometimes the quiet recitation of old myths that seemed to weave themselves into the day's labor. The master weaver was more than a technical guide. They were a custodian of tradition, deciding which patterns could be taught, which materials were worthy of high-paying clients, and how the reputation of the workshop would be protected. For all its quiet order, the workshop was not without challenges. The demand for fine cloth was constant, but so too were the pressures of competition. Other workshops in the city, and even in neighboring cities, sought to win the favor of wealthy patrons, offering lower prices or boasting of rare dyes. A single flawed commission could harm the standing of the entire team, while a masterpiece could secure years of prosperity. The work could also be physically taxing. Hours at the loom strained the back and eyes, the repetitive motion wearing on shoulders and hands. In the height of summer, when the air inside the workshop grew heavy and still, sweat would dampen the fibers, making them harder to work with. In the winter, the chill stiffened fingers until the movement of the shuttle became awkward and slow. Yet despite the hardships, there was a quiet pride in the craft. The weavers knew that each piece they produced would go out into the world as both a practical object and a work of art, wrapping someone in warmth, adorning someone in beauty, or carrying symbolic meaning into rituals and ceremonies. In this way, the act of weaving was more than labor. It was participation in the life of the city, a thread in the larger fabric of Mesopotamian culture. By evening, when the looms fell silent and the last shafts of sunlight faded from the walls, the workshop emptied slowly. Some weavers lingered to finish a row of weaving, unwilling to leave the pattern incomplete. Others stepped into the streets where the smell of cooking fires mingled with the dust of the day, their minds already turning to tomorrow's work. The tools would wait, the fibers would rest, and the patient rhythm of the loom would resume again with the dawn, carrying forward a tradition as enduring as the walls of the city itself. Beyond the walls of the workshop, the life of a Mesopotamian woven cloth did not end with the final knot tied at the loom. In many ways, its journey was only beginning. The trade networks of ancient Mesopotamia were like veins carrying lifeblood across the region, connecting cities, kingdoms, and distant cultures. Finished bolts of fabric, folded and wrapped in protective coverings, would be carried from the workshop to the bustling markets, where merchants with sharp eyes and quick tongues assessed their value. Here, amidst the shouts of traders and the clink of scales measuring silver or barley, the fate of each piece was decided. Some would be purchased locally, destined to clothe the wealthy or adorn the interiors of temples and palaces. Others were marked for longer journeys, handed over to caravans that would carry them far from the city where they were woven. Merchants were the invisible partners of the weavers, their skill lying not in the shuttle or spindle, but in negotiation and navigation. They understood the tastes of foreign markets, knowing which regions prized deep indigo blues, which preferred the rich reds of madder dye, and which valued the intricate geometric patterns that spoke of Mesopotamian mastery. Once purchased, the cloth might travel along riverboats that drifted slowly down the Euphrates or Tigris, the bales protected under woven mats to guard against rain and sun. Others would be strapped onto the backs of camels in long caravans that crossed arid stretches, their bells marking the slow progress from one trading hub to the next. The journey could take weeks or even months, and by the time the fabric reached its destination, it might be worth many times the price paid in the original market. These textiles were more than luxury items. They were symbols of connection between cultures. In distant cities, a finely woven Mesopotamian garment was as much a statement of prestige as it was a functional object. Rulers gifted them to allies, merchants used them to cement relationships, and in some cases, they became part of sacred rituals, carrying with them the unseen hands of the weavers who had worked in the quiet light of their workshop. The routes were not without risk. Bandits lurked along less traveled paths, sudden storms could halt river traffic, and political disputes between city-states could close key routes entirely. Merchants often traveled with guards or in large groups, both for protection and to pool resources for the long journey. But the demand for Mesopotamian textiles was strong enough to make the risk worthwhile. For the weavers back home, news of where their work had traveled was rare, but when it came, it was a source of quiet pride. Sometimes a merchant would return with a scrap of foreign cloth, traded in return for their own work, and the weavers would marvel at the different textures and patterns. It was a reminder that while their days were spent within the walls of the workshop, their work walked far beyond them, brushing against lives they would never meet. The trade also brought influence in the other direction. Along with goods, merchants carried stories, designs, and techniques from other lands. A new type of border pattern might make its way into the workshop after a merchant returned from the Levant, or a novel dyeing method could be whispered about after trade with artisans from the Indus Valley. Over time, these exchanges enriched the Mesopotamian weaving tradition, blending local mastery with the artistry of distant places. As the sun set on the city, the looms may have been still, but in the mind of the master weaver, patterns continued to form. The knowledge that their work might one day be worn by a noble in a far-off court or displayed in a temple across the desert was not a matter of boastful pride, but of a quiet, enduring satisfaction. In this way, the weaving workshop was both a local craft space and an unseen participant in the great network of trade that bound the ancient world together, each thread a silent ambassador of Mesopotamia's skill, patience, and artistry. In ancient Mesopotamia, textiles were more than everyday necessities. They held deep, symbolic meaning that wove them into the spiritual and ceremonial life of the people. Within the walls of temples dedicated to gods like Inanna, Marduk, and Enlil, finely woven cloth was as essential as offerings of grain or libations of oil. Priests and priestesses wore garments of specific colors and patterns during rituals, each choice laden with meaning understood by all who attended. White linen, pure and unadorned, symbolized cleanliness and divine favor, while deep blues and purples were linked to the heavens, their colors derived from rare and costly dyes. In sacred processions, banners of woven cloth fluttered in the wind, their embroidered patterns telling stories of myths and victories, of blessings sought and blessings received. These banners were not merely decorations. They acted as visible prayers, carrying the intentions of the people upward toward the divine. Within the sanctuaries, curtains and hangings shielded the most sacred spaces from ordinary eyes, their intricate designs meant to honor the gods and to create an atmosphere of awe. The weaving of these ceremonial textiles was itself considered a form of devotion. Special workshops, often attached to temples, employed skilled artisans who may have regarded their work as a sacred duty rather than a mere profession. Before beginning a major project, offerings might be made, a short prayer whispered, or incense burned to invite divine inspiration. In some city-states, records inscribed on clay tablets detailed how certain festivals required specific types of cloth, both in terms of color and in the motifs woven into them. A harvest festival might call for golden-hued cloth with patterns resembling stalks of barley, while a celebration of a deity associated with water might require flowing wave patterns in shades of blue and green. During these festivals, textiles played a starring role. Altars were draped in richly dyed fabrics, and statues of gods were dressed in newly woven garments, replacing older ones that had served their time. These older garments were often stored carefully, sometimes buried in temple grounds, as they were considered infused with divine presence and thus too sacred to be reused for ordinary purposes. Weddings and other life milestones also involved significant textile traditions. A bride's clothing was often a statement of her family's wealth and standing, with fabrics chosen to impress not just the groom's family, but the wider community. In wealthier households, the weaving of dowry cloth might begin years before a daughter's marriage, with the best artisans employed to ensure the quality reflected the family's pride. Funeral rites, too, incorporated textiles in meaningful ways. The deceased might be wrapped in fine cloth, both as a sign of respect and as a practical offering to the gods of the underworld. In some burials, the textile wrappings bore woven or embroidered symbols meant to protect the soul on its journey. The weavers themselves, though rarely named in surviving records, must have understood the weight of their work in these contexts. A bolt of cloth destined for a market might be measured in silver, but a ceremonial textile carried a value beyond coin, for it was intertwined with the identity of the community and its connection to the divine. In creating such works, the weavers were not just artisans, they were participants in the great spiritual dialogue between mortals and their gods. The quiet rhythm of the loom in the temple workshop was a sound that, in its own way, was as much a hymn as the chanting of priests. When a cloth was completed, there might be a small blessing ceremony before it was presented for its sacred purpose. This gesture acknowledged the belief that the fabric carried with it the intentions, skill, and perhaps even the prayers of those who had made it. In this way, textiles in Mesopotamia were never merely functional. They were carriers of meaning, witnesses to milestones, and silent participants in the rituals that bound together the life of the city, the devotion of its people, and the presence of its gods. In the bustling cities of ancient Mesopotamia, where mud brick walls lined narrow streets and market stalls spilled into the open squares, textiles were more than just a means of covering the body. They were a language of status, a silent proclamation of who a person was, what they owned, and where they stood in the delicate hierarchy of society. From the wealthy merchant seated in the shaded courtyard of his home to the high priestess making her way through the temple gates, the quality, color, and craftsmanship of one's clothing spoke volumes without a single word being uttered. In a world where social class defined one's privileges, duties, and even the legal consequences for certain actions, the garments a person wore could be as telling as the deeds they performed. Fine linen, smooth to the touch and shimmering faintly in the sunlight, was a fabric of the elite, imported at great cost or woven by the most skilled artisans whose work was valued in silver and gold. Deeply dyed cloth, particularly in rare hues such as indigo, crimson, or the coveted purple, signaled access to resources and trade networks that stretched far beyond the city walls. To wear such colors was to carry on your body a mark of wealth and influence, a visual declaration that your household had the means to acquire what others could only dream of. The patterns woven into these garments also carried meaning. Geometric designs, zigzags, and stylized flora might be purely decorative for some, yet in certain contexts they echoed cultural symbols or protective motifs. For the ruling classes, these details could be tailored to reflect authority, prosperity, and divine favor. For Mesopotamian kings often portrayed themselves as chosen by the gods, and their attire reinforced this narrative. Women of high standing adorned themselves not only in fine fabrics, but also in layered fringes, embroidered panels, and delicate beadwork that shimmered in the dim light of an oil lamp. Each thread and stitch represented hours, sometimes days, of labor, work carried out by hands that would never wear the finished garment. For the weavers and embroiderers, their creations were markers of someone else's prestige, yet in them lay their own quiet artistry and reputation. Even among common citizens, clothing played a role in defining identity. A well-kept tunic, modest but neatly woven, could signal diligence and self-respect, qualities valued in trade, marriage arrangements, and community life. For a craftsman, the simple durability of his workwear might speak to his reliability. For a farmer, the coarse but sturdy fabric allowed for movement in the fields, signaling a life built on hard labor rather than the accumulation of luxury. In the great markets, bolts of cloth lay folded in neat stacks, their colors and textures drawing the eye of potential buyers. A single purchase could transform a family's social perception, an investment in appearances that could pay dividends in negotiations or courtship. It was understood that clothing could be a form of currency, a way to open doors or command respect, and so textiles themselves were traded, gifted, and used to settle debts. Nobles might give fine garments as rewards for loyalty, sealing bonds of service, while temples might accept cloth as part of religious offerings, storing them for use in ceremonies or as gifts to dignitaries. The legal codes of Mesopotamia, such as the famous Code of Hammurabi, even included regulations regarding trade in textiles, reflecting their economic significance. Penalties existed for fraudulent claims about quality or misrepresentation of a dye, for in a society where appearances mattered greatly, the integrity of one's garments was no small affair. For travelers arriving in a new city, their clothing was the first introduction they offered to strangers. For the host welcoming guests, the quality of household attire spoke to the family's honor. Thus, garments became not only personal possessions, but also extensions of reputation, woven into the social fabric of Mesopotamian life as tightly as any thread in a loom. In every thread, color, and fold, clothing in ancient Mesopotamia told a story, not only of individual identity, but of a society that measured value, ambition, and belonging through the warp and weft of woven cloth. The textile industry of ancient Mesopotamia was not merely a craft passed from one generation to the next. It was an economic pillar that supported cities, sustained trade networks, and connected the heart of the Fertile Crescent to distant lands. In a time when coinage was rare and barter was common, cloth was as valuable as silver, and, in some contexts, even more versatile. It could be worn, stored, transported, and exchanged for food, livestock, or other goods. This meant that every bolt of fabric leaving a workshop was not only a product, but also a form of currency circulating through the marketplace. The production of textiles involved a carefully organized chain of labor, and each step, from the shearing of sheep to the dyeing of finished cloth, represented a specialized skill. Shepherds tended flocks whose wool would become the foundation of the industry. The quality of wool depended on the breed, the animal's diet, and the care taken during shearing. Finer wool came from animals raised on good pasture, producing a softer and more desirable yarn, while coarser wool served well for work garments and heavy-duty uses. Spinners transformed raw fibers into thread using drop spindles, a process requiring patience and steady hands. The evenness of the thread determined the smoothness of the final cloth, and master spinners could command higher payment for their skill. Once spun, the thread moved into the hands of weavers, often women working at vertical looms set up in workshops or within their homes. Here, threads were aligned in the warp, and the weft was passed back and forth, slowly creating the dense fabric that would be cut and sewn into garments or traded as whole cloth. Dyeing was an art in itself, and the procurement of dyes formed another layer of economic activity. Some colors could be produced from locally available plants, but others, especially the more vivid and long-lasting hues, required imported materials. Indigo might travel from distant lands. The deep reds and purples came from rare plants or mollusks that required labor-intensive extraction processes. Because of the cost and rarity of such dyes, garments colored with them became symbols of wealth and exclusivity. This dye trade tied Mesopotamia to broader commercial routes, linking the cities along the Tigris and Euphrates to traders in the Indus Valley, Anatolia, and beyond. Workshops were often under the patronage of temples or wealthy households. In the temple context, textiles could be produced as part of offerings to the gods, as tribute to rulers, or as items for ceremonial use. The temple might own flocks, fields for growing dye plants, and employ dozens of workers in a self-contained economy. In wealthy estates, textile production might be organized to supply the household's needs and to generate surplus for trade. Contracts for textile work were not uncommon, recorded on clay tablets that detailed quantities, deadlines, and quality expectations. Disputes over workmanship or missed delivery could be brought before local authorities, showing that textiles were not just craft work, but also subject to legal frameworks that recognized their value. Merchants, too, played a critical role, transporting cloth to other cities or exchanging it for foreign goods such as metals, stones, or exotic spices. In some cases, traders carried Mesopotamian textiles to places where such craftsmanship was rare, making them luxury goods in foreign markets. This expanded the reputation of Mesopotamian weaving and increased demand, encouraging further specialization and innovation back home. The cyclical nature of the industry, shearing in spring, spinning and weaving through the year, dyeing when conditions allowed, created a steady rhythm in both urban and rural life. For many families, involvement in textile production was the primary source of income, whether they worked in the bustling city workshops or in smaller village settings. The scale could range from a single loom in a family home to large-scale operations employing dozens of workers under a master weaver. This entire network formed an economic backbone that supported not only the livelihoods of individuals, but also the prosperity of the cities themselves. Taxes, tribute, and trade revenues linked to textiles contributed to the funding of public works, the maintenance of temples, and the sustenance of armies. Thus, in ancient Mesopotamia, every woven thread was tied not only to a person's hands, but also to the larger structure of society, where craft and commerce intertwined so closely that the fortunes of the weavers' workshops could influence the fortunes of the entire city. Beyond its role in the economy, weaving in ancient Mesopotamia held a deep cultural and symbolic presence that permeated daily life, mythology, and religious practice. The act of interlacing threads was often seen as a metaphor for the interconnectedness of human fate, divine will, and the cycles of nature. In the myths and epics of the region, gods and goddesses were sometimes described as weavers of destiny, their looms stretching across the heavens, each thread representing the life of a person or the rise and fall of a city. The goddess Utu, in particular, was associated with weaving, and in certain traditions, she was depicted as the divine patroness of textile work. In the stories told by priests and elders, Utu's loom was not merely a tool, but a cosmic instrument, weaving the fabric of existence itself, with each movement of the shuttle shaping the course of history. For the people of Mesopotamia, this idea elevated weaving from a practical craft to an act imbued with spiritual resonance. It was not unusual for weavers to offer prayers or small tokens to the gods before beginning a significant piece of work, especially if the textile was intended for a temple or for ceremonial garments. In households, woven items often carried protective or symbolic designs, patterns that, to an untrained eye, might seem decorative, but to those within the culture carried meaning. Geometric motifs could signify protection from evil forces. Repeating lines and knots might represent continuity and stability. Certain color combinations could be associated with specific deities or blessings. When textiles were gifted, whether in marriage dowries, as offerings to rulers, or as tokens of alliance between trading partners, the choice of patterns and dyes could communicate messages without a single word spoken. The act of giving a finely woven cloth was both a material and a symbolic gesture, a display of wealth, skill, and cultural knowledge. In the domestic sphere, weaving was often a communal activity, particularly among women. Older women passed down techniques, patterns, and methods to younger generations, not only teaching the mechanics of the craft, but also sharing stories, songs, and wisdom. In this way, the loom became both a workplace and a place of education, where cultural memory was preserved in the rhythm of the shuttle and the twist of the thread. Even the tools themselves carried significance. A spindle or loom handed down through generations was more than a piece of equipment. It was a link to the ancestors, worn smooth by the hands of those who came before. Such objects were cared for and sometimes even buried with their owners, symbolizing the enduring connection between craft, identity, and the afterlife. In major cities like Ur, Babylon, and Nineveh, textiles also played a role in ceremonial life. Festivals might feature processions in which priests and priestesses wore elaborately woven robes dyed in brilliant colors, the designs telling stories of gods, kings, and victories. The visual splendor of such garments reinforced the power and prestige of the city's leaders and religious institutions. These textiles were often preserved for reuse in future ceremonies, stored carefully in temple treasuries where they could be brought out on significant occasions. The symbolic importance of weaving extended even into law and governance. In some legal codes, fines or penalties could be paid in cloth, particularly high-quality dyed fabric. This formal recognition of textiles as a medium of exchange underscored their central place in Mesopotamian society. Because weaving touched so many aspects of life, economic, spiritual, social, it was a craft that defined both the daily routines and the grand expressions of civilization. When a weaver sat at their loom, they participated in an unbroken tradition that stretched back generations, tying their own labor to the work of ancestors and to the larger fabric of the community. The hum of the loom, the steady beat of the shuttle, the slow growth of the patterned cloth, all these were part of the quiet, persistent rhythm of Mesopotamian life. In this sense, Every woven piece was more than a product. It was a tangible piece of history, carrying within it the labor, beliefs, and identity of a people whose civilization shaped the ancient world. And as the centuries passed, the threads of these weavings would, in their own way, continue to connect the present to the distant past, just as they once connected the hands of the weaver to the heart of their culture. That brings us to the end of our previous story. Before we move on to the next one, I'd be grateful if you could give me a like and a subscribe. And now, let's continue with the next chapter in our series of Boring History for Sleep, as we explore the history of soap making in early civilizations. Under the dim glow of early human settlements, long before the concept of daily bathing or personal hygiene became a common expectation, the first rudimentary forms of soap making began to emerge. These early attempts were not the smooth, fragrant bars we might imagine today, but rather crude, lumpy mixtures that served a far more practical purpose. Archaeological evidence suggests that as early as 2800 BCE, the Babylonians had discovered a basic method for creating soap-like substances by boiling fats with ashes, producing a cleaning agent that could be used for washing textiles and possibly the body. It is thought that this knowledge developed out of necessity, as early cities became denser and the need for cleaner living conditions grew. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform script have been found, detailing recipes that combined water, alkali, and cassia oil to produce a material used in both cleansing and medicinal contexts. This mixture was particularly valued for its ability to treat certain skin conditions, suggesting that from the very beginning, soap making was intertwined with both hygiene and health. Across the Nile in ancient Egypt, records from around 1500 BCE mention similar cleansing concoctions, though Egyptian recipes often included animal or vegetable oils blended with alkaline salts. These mixtures were used not only for personal washing, but also for laundering linen and preparing wool for weaving. Egyptian society, with its emphasis on ritual purification, likely encouraged the refinement of these formulas, making soap making a respected and practical skill. As trade routes expanded, the knowledge of soap making spread between civilizations, with the Phoenicians playing a notable role in transmitting techniques across the Mediterranean. They are believed to have used goat tallow and wood ash to create a substance effective for cleaning wool, which was a critical step in the textile industry of the time. The Greeks and Romans, although aware of these soap-like materials, initially preferred to clean themselves by scraping the skin with strigils and using oil to lift away dirt. However, by the 2nd century CE, Roman writings began to mention the use of soap for both washing clothes and bathing. The Gallic and Germanic tribes were particularly known for their soap-making skills, often producing a harder substance that was colored and scented, and the Romans eventually adopted these practices. Early soaps were far from standardized. The quality and effectiveness varied greatly depending on the source materials available. In areas rich in olive trees, such as the Mediterranean, olive oil was a favored base for soap making, producing a softer, more conditioning soap. In regions where animal fats were more accessible, the resulting soap was often harder and more abrasive, better suited for heavy cleaning tasks. The alkali component, usually derived from plant ashes, could vary in strength, which meant that some early soaps were harsh on the skin, while others were comparatively gentle. Beyond cleanliness, soap held cultural and even symbolic value in some societies. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, the act of cleansing was often linked to spiritual purity, a concept that resonated in religious rituals and daily life. The production of cleansing agents was therefore not just a matter of utility, but also of maintaining harmony between the physical and the spiritual. In the marketplaces of ancient cities, soap or its raw materials were traded alongside spices, textiles, and precious metals, indicating its recognized value as a commodity. Soap making also reflected the resourcefulness of early civilizations, as artisans learned to utilize byproducts from other industries, such as animal fats from butchering or ashes from cooking fires, to create something entirely new. This practice not only provided a solution to waste disposal, but also laid the foundation for a craft that would evolve over millennia. In many ways, the history of early soap making is a story of small discoveries accumulating over time. Each civilization added its own twist to the process, influenced by geography, resources, and cultural needs. Whether a lump of harsh, ash-based cleaner in a Mesopotamian workshop, or a carefully mixed batch of olive oil soap in an Egyptian home, These creations marked humanity's gradual shift toward recognizing the importance of cleanliness in daily life. This early experimentation and exchange of knowledge would eventually lead to the more sophisticated soap-making techniques of the medieval period. But even in its primitive forms, soap had already begun to transform human habits and health. It is within these humble beginnings that we can trace not only the roots of personal hygiene, but also the ingenuity and adaptability that have always defined human progress, quietly shaping the way people lived, worked, and interacted thousands of years ago. As early soap-making practices continued to develop, the craft began to take on more structure, moving from simple household preparation to a specialized skill passed down through generations. In Mesopotamia, artisans working in small workshops would carefully gather the ingredients needed for their mixtures. Animal fats, often from sheep or cattle, were rendered down in large clay or bronze vessels, their impurities skimmed away to leave a cleaner base. Ashes from burnt hardwoods were leached in water to produce an alkaline solution, which, when combined with the hot fats, would slowly thicken into a paste-like substance. This paste could be shaped, stored, and left to cure, becoming more solid over time. In some cases, the makers would add aromatic herbs or oils, not only to mask the strong smell of the fats, but also to impart medicinal properties. This deliberate addition of fragrance hinted at an early understanding that cleanliness could also be a sensory experience, linking the act of washing with a feeling of renewal. In Egypt, soap-making techniques likely benefited from the abundance of plant-based oils, particularly castor and sesame, as well as from natron, a naturally occurring blend of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate harvested from dry lake beds. Natron had been used for centuries in the mummification process, its powerful cleansing and preservative qualities well known. When incorporated into soap mixtures, it produced a more effective and longer-lasting product, especially valued by the upper classes, who could afford to maintain linen garments in pristine condition. The connection between soap and textile care was strong in ancient times, as fine fabrics required gentle yet thorough cleaning to preserve their appearance. In the Mediterranean, particularly in Phoenician and later Roman territories, soap-making adapted to suit the needs of diverse populations. For example, in trading ports where olive oil was plentiful, it became the preferred fat for producing softer soaps that were easier on the skin. These olive oil soaps, when properly cured, could be stored for long periods and even shipped over great distances, making them an important trade good. In northern climates, where animal fats remained dominant, the resulting soaps were harder and often used more for laundering and household cleaning than for personal bathing. The spread of soap-making knowledge was aided by the growing networks of trade and conquest. When the Romans encountered the soap-making traditions of the Gauls and Germans, they were impressed by the quality of the products, which were often dyed with natural pigments or infused with herbal scents. Roman authors such as Pliny the Elder documented these practices, noting that certain regions were particularly skilled at producing soaps for both cosmetic and medicinal use. However, even within Rome, bathing customs remained varied, with some preferring traditional oil and strigil methods, while others embraced the use of soap in the baths. The process of making soap was labor-intensive and required a good understanding of proportion and timing. If the alkaline solution was too strong, the soap could be caustic and damage the skin. Too weak, and it would fail to clean effectively. Skilled soap makers learned to judge their mixtures by sight, smell, and texture, adjusting their techniques to produce the desired consistency. Over time, this knowledge became more formalized, with specific regions gaining reputations for producing superior soaps. In some cases, soap making became tied to religious or cultural rituals. In Babylonian temples, for instance, purification before entering sacred spaces might involve washing with special cleansing agents, possibly including early forms of soap. In Egypt, similar practices surrounded the preparation of priests before ceremonies. These traditions reinforced the symbolic link between physical cleanliness and spiritual purity, elevating soap making from a purely domestic craft to one with cultural and ceremonial significance. As centuries passed, the integration of soap into daily life began to influence social expectations. In wealthier households, having a supply of well-made soap signaled not only cleanliness, but also status, as it demonstrated access to quality materials and skilled labor. In bustling urban centers, soap makers set up shop near markets, selling their goods alongside food, pottery, and fabrics. They sometimes branded their products with distinctive shapes or markings, ensuring that customers could recognize their preferred source. While the techniques of early soap making were still relatively primitive by modern standards, they represented a remarkable blend of observation, experimentation, and adaptation. Each civilization contributed its own refinements, shaped by geography, resources, and cultural values. Whether used to cleanse the body, wash garments, or prepare wool for weaving, soap served as a quiet but essential part of daily life. It was not a luxury reserved for a few, nor yet a universal necessity, but rather a tool that bridged the gap between survival and comfort, practicality and ritual. This gradual evolution of the craft would eventually set the stage for the more sophisticated methods developed in the medieval Islamic world and later in Europe, where soap would become an everyday staple. But in these early civilizations, every bar, lump, or paste of soap carried with it the legacy of experimentation, trade, and cultural exchange that made such an unassuming object a cornerstone of human ingenuity. As soap-making knowledge moved beyond the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, it began to adapt to the environments, resources, and cultural habits of each new region it touched. In the lands of the early Hebrews, cleansing practices often had deep ritual significance, and it is believed that alkaline substances derived from plant ashes were used in conjunction with oils and fats for purification rites long before they became part of everyday bathing. Historical records suggest that these mixtures were valued not merely for their ability to remove dirt, but for their symbolic role in restoring ritual purity, reinforcing the idea that soap was as much about the spirit as it was about the skin. As trade expanded during the height of the Phoenician and later Carthaginian maritime empires, so too did the spread of soap making. These skilled seafarers carried with them olive oil-based recipes that were softer, more luxurious, and well-suited to warmer climates. In bustling ports, soap became a modest but valuable commodity, traded alongside dyes, spices, and fine textiles. Some recipes included aromatic resins like frankincense or myrrh, turning a mundane cleansing product into something exotic and desirable. Meanwhile, in the colder climates of Northern Europe, the approach to soap making was shaped by necessity rather than luxury. Here, animal fats, particularly from cattle and pigs, were abundant, while olive oil was scarce and expensive. The resulting soaps were harder, more robust, and primarily used for laundering clothing and cleaning tools, though in some communities they were also applied to the bodies during rare full-body washes. In these regions, personal bathing was often limited to certain times of the year, making soap a precious resource rather than an everyday staple. Among the Celts and Germanic tribes, archaeological evidence points to the use of soaps dyed with natural plant pigments, possibly to create a product that combined cleansing with decorative body art for rituals or festivals. The Romans, ever attentive to useful innovations, documented and occasionally adopted these techniques, though they continued to favor their traditional oil and strigil method of cleaning the skin in bathhouses. Nonetheless, the Roman presence in Britain and Gaul likely helped introduce Mediterranean-style soap to these regions, planting the seeds for its future evolution. Across the Mediterranean and North Africa, the blending of local traditions with imported methods produced unique variations. Here, soap making might incorporate plant oils like argan, abundant in certain regions, and would often be combined with naturally abrasive substances such as fine sands or ground shells, creating exfoliating cleansers for both skin and fabrics. These adaptations highlight how local materials and environmental conditions could shape the texture, color, and scent of soap. The craft was not static. It was continually refined by experimentation, trade, and cultural exchange. In the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant, soap making began to intertwine with early forms of commercial branding. Artisans sometimes marked their products with unique symbols pressed into the surface before curing, ensuring customers could identify their preferred maker. These marks might indicate origin, quality, or even the intended use, whether for household chores, laundering fine linen, or personal grooming. The sophistication of this practice foreshadowed later developments in medieval Aleppo and Nablus, where soap making would become an art form tied to civic pride and long-standing family businesses. In many early societies, soap making remained a task performed within the household, especially among rural populations who could gather their own fats and ashes. The process, while simple in concept, required patience and a certain degree of skill to avoid producing a harsh, unusable product. Families passed down their preferred recipes, and in some cases, soap making became part of seasonal domestic routines, much like preserving food or spinning wool. This familiarity meant that even in regions without professional soap makers, the knowledge persisted. Yet as urban centers grew and economies became more specialized, dedicated soap makers emerged, operating workshops near sources of raw materials and markets. These artisans sometimes diversified their output, producing both functional cleaning soaps and more refined versions scented with flowers or herbs for wealthier clientele. In port cities, where contact with distant cultures was frequent, the range of available scents and additives expanded, giving rise to a kind of early cosmetic industry. Over time, soap came to represent not just cleanliness, but also social standing. The ability to own and use scented, well-crafted soap implied access to trade networks, disposable income, and a concern for personal presentation that was increasingly valued in sophisticated urban societies. This gradual cultural shift, combined with the practical benefits of better hygiene, ensured that soap making would remain an important and evolving craft well into the medieval period. By this stage in history, soap had already traveled across continents, taking on new forms and meanings in each place it settled. It had been a temple tool for purification, a household staple for laundering, a trade good in bustling markets, and a quiet marker of refinement for the privileged few. Its story in these early centuries reveals not only the ingenuity of ancient peoples, but also the beginnings of a shared human understanding that the simple act of washing could be a gateway to health, dignity, and even a touch of beauty. By the time the early medieval period began to take shape, the knowledge of soap making had spread far beyond its original cradles in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean, adapting once more to a changing world marked by shifting trade routes, the rise and fall of empires, and evolving attitudes toward hygiene. In the Byzantine Empire, the tradition of crafting soap remained closely tied to the use of olive oil, which was abundant in the eastern Mediterranean. Workshops in cities like Constantinople produced fine, mild soaps prized for their smooth texture and gentle scent. These were often molded into compact bars, and sometimes infused with aromatic herbs or floral waters, making them sought-after goods among the elite. Soap from this period was not purely utilitarian. It carried a certain prestige, signaling refinement in both domestic life and personal grooming. Further west, in what had once been the Western Roman provinces, the decline of large urban centers and the disruption of long-distance trade had a noticeable impact on the availability of high-quality soap. In many rural areas, soap making reverted to a more basic, home-based activity, relying heavily on locally available animal fats and the ashes of hardwoods. The result was a coarse, strong-smelling product better suited for laundering heavy woolens and cleaning tools than for daily bathing. Yet even in this cruder form, soap remained important, particularly for maintaining household goods and clothing in a time when textiles were labor-intensive to produce and repair. In the Islamic world, which rose to prominence in the 7th century and rapidly expanded across North Africa, the Middle East, and into parts of Europe, soap making achieved new heights of sophistication. Artisans in cities like Aleppo refined techniques that produced hard, long-lasting bars using olive oil combined with lye derived from plant ashes. Aleppo soap, in particular, became famous for its pale green color, subtle laurel scent, and gentle cleansing properties. It was cured for months to improve its quality, and its reputation spread along the trade routes that linked Damascus, Baghdad, and beyond. Islamic scholars and chemists documented methods for creating alkaline solutions more precisely, helping standardize production and elevate soap making to a recognized craft. This period also saw the integration of soap into cultural rituals of cleanliness, especially given the emphasis on ablution in Islamic daily life, making it not merely a luxury, but a practical and spiritual necessity. In Northern and Western Europe, contact with the Islamic world through trade, diplomacy, and the Crusades reintroduced more refined soap-making practices. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa became important hubs for importing olive oil and exporting high-quality soaps to markets as far away as England and the Low Countries. By the 12th century, professional guilds of soap makers had begun to appear in parts of Spain, France, and Italy, regulating quality, controlling production methods, and ensuring that their members could compete in a growing marketplace. The city of Marseille, in particular, would become synonymous with fine olive oil soap, building on a legacy that began in this era. While much of medieval Europe still viewed bathing as an occasional activity, public bathhouses existed in many towns, and soap was often sold there alongside oils and towels. However, the Black Death and subsequent plagues in the 14th century led to changes in hygiene habits, with some populations fearing that bathing might open the pores to disease. Even so, the use of soap for laundering and limited personal washing persisted, ensuring the craft survived periods of shifting medical theory and cultural practice. Outside of Europe, soap-making traditions continued to evolve independently. In West Africa, for example, local communities developed soaps using palm oil and potash from plant ashes, producing a dark, soft soap still made in some regions today. These versions served both practical and ceremonial purposes, highlighting again how the craft adapted to available resources and local needs. In Asia, particularly in China and Japan, soap-like substances were made using a mix of plant-based oils and alkaline salts, though other cleansing agents like rice bran or fermented mixtures remained more common for personal hygiene. What is striking about this period is how soap, once an experimental mixture of fats and ashes in the ancient world, had by now become embedded in the economic, cultural, and even spiritual life of many civilizations. Whether traded along the Silk Road, sold in bustling Mediterranean ports, or made in small rural kitchens, it had secured its place as a product that crossed social and geographic boundaries. The medieval centuries laid the groundwork for the soap industry that would later emerge in the Renaissance, an era that would combine scientific curiosity, expanding trade, and growing urban populations to transform soap from a regional craft into a global commodity. This transformation would carry the story of soap into new markets and new forms, setting the stage for the industrial innovations that would follow in the early modern world. As Europe transitioned into the Renaissance, the art of soap making entered a phase of renewed refinement and expansion, influenced by the growing wealth of cities, the revival of classical knowledge, and the strengthening of global trade networks. By the 15th and 16th centuries, regions like southern France, Italy, and Spain had become leading producers, each developing its own distinctive style and reputation. In Marseille, soap makers perfected the use of pure olive oil, combined with alkaline lye derived from the ashes of Mediterranean plants, producing a smooth, long-lasting bar with a fresh, clean scent. This Marseille soap was often pale green or off-white, molded into large blocks, and stamped with the maker's seal, a mark of both quality and civic pride. The product was so valued that it became regulated by local authorities, who imposed strict rules to ensure purity and prevent adulteration with cheaper animal fats. Across the Mediterranean in the Italian states, particularly in cities like Genoa and Venice, soap making was closely tied to the mercantile wealth that flowed through their ports. Venetian soap makers, benefiting from access to high-quality olive oil and exotic fragrances brought in by merchants from the East, began experimenting with scented varieties, infusing their soaps with lavender, rose, and even spices like cinnamon or clove. These luxury soaps were sold to wealthy households and used as gifts in diplomatic exchanges, reflecting the increasing association between fine soap and social status. In Spain, especially in Castile, soap makers created a product known for its creamy lather and mildness, often using a blend of olive oil and soda ash from the burning of certain coastal plants. Castile soap became renowned across Europe, exported in hard white bars that traveled north to England, the Low Countries, and Germany. Its reputation was so strong that the term Castile soap would become a generic name for high-quality white soap long after its origins were forgotten. Northern Europe, too, began to develop its own soap industries during this period. In England, the craft was initially concentrated in London, where imported olive oil from southern Europe was combined with locally available tallow to produce a harder, more affordable soap. While tallow-based soaps lacked the luxurious qualities of the pure olive oil varieties, they were practical, effective, and accessible to a broader population. Over time, English soap makers sought to improve their product by refining their fats more carefully and experimenting with imported oils, though high tariffs on foreign soap and raw materials often limited their options. This period also marked the rise of soap guilds and the codification of trade practices. In cities across Europe, guilds regulated not only the quality of ingredients and methods, but also the branding, packaging, and marketing of soaps. Membership in these guilds was often hereditary or required lengthy apprenticeships, ensuring that the craft was both a family trade and a closely guarded economic asset. Guild records from the period reveal the importance of soap as a taxable and regulated commodity, with its production contributing to municipal revenues and its sale reaching far beyond local markets. At the same time, bathing culture itself began to shift. While medieval fears of disease from bathing had discouraged frequent washing, the Renaissance brought renewed interest in personal cleanliness, influenced in part by medical theories that emphasized the benefits of moderate washing to maintain health. Public bathhouses, though still fewer than in ancient times, saw some revival, and in private homes, the growing availability of soap encouraged more regular washing of hands, faces, and linens. In the Islamic world, soap making remained highly developed, and trade routes ensured that the knowledge and goods of Middle Eastern soap makers continued to influence European production. Aleppo soap, with its distinctive laurel oil content, was exported in increasing quantities, often traveling to Venice or Marseille before being redistributed across the continent. These Middle Eastern products were admired for their quality and longevity, and in some cases, they directly inspired European imitations. Beyond Europe and the Middle East, the age of exploration began introducing Europeans to new plant oils and ashes from Africa, Asia, and the Americas. While these exotic materials would not be fully integrated into European soap making until later centuries, the seeds of a globalized soap industry were being planted. The Renaissance period thus stands as a bridge between ancient and medieval traditions and the industrial future of soap making. It was an era in which craftsmanship was still valued, ingredients were chosen for quality rather than cost alone, and soap retained its dual identity as both a daily necessity and a mark of refinement. In the coming centuries, advances in chemistry, colonial trade, and mechanization would transform soap making into a vast industrial enterprise. But the foundations laid in the Renaissance, purity of ingredients, regulation of standards, and the blending of utility with luxury, would endure as guiding principles. This was also the time when soap, once a regional specialty, became a recognized commodity across the European world, finding its way into households of nobles, merchants, and increasingly the common people, paving the way for its eventual role as a universal staple of daily life. By the 17th and 18th centuries, soap making had become not only an essential craft, but also a politically and economically significant industry across Europe and its growing colonial empires. The early modern period brought an expansion of both production methods and markets, fueled by population growth, increased trade, and the gradual spread of the idea that cleanliness was linked to health, morality, and social respectability. In France, the city of Marseille continued to dominate the market with its olive oil-based soap, but now under the strict regulation of the French crown. In 1688, King Louis XIV issued the Edict of Colbert, which laid down precise rules for what could be called savon de Marseille. The law specified that only pure olive oil and alkaline lye from sea plants could be used, banning the addition of cheaper animal fats. It also required that soap be boiled for at least 10 days in large copper cauldrons to achieve the desired purity. This regulation ensured that Marseille soap retained its reputation for exceptional quality and became a highly sought-after export, not just within France, but throughout Europe and into the colonies. England's soap industry followed a different path, shaped by both innovation and heavy taxation. Beginning in 1712, the British government imposed a high excise duty on soap to raise revenue, which forced soap makers to keep detailed production records and submit to inspections. This tax lasted for over a century, making soap relatively expensive and limiting access for the poorer classes. Yet, despite these restrictions, English soap making flourished in cities like London, Bristol, and Liverpool, where merchants imported raw materials such as olive oil, palm oil, and coconut oil from overseas territories. English producers refined techniques for blending these oils with tallow, creating soaps that balanced hardness, lather, and affordability. In Spain, Castile soap maintained its elite status, with its bright white color and creamy texture admired across the continent. Spanish producers also benefited from their empire's global reach, experimenting with oils from the Americas and the Philippines. Meanwhile, in Italy, Venice's long tradition of perfumed soap continued, with artisans creating luxury products for aristocratic and merchant families, often molded into ornate shapes and wrapped in decorated paper. The expansion of European empires meant that soap making was no longer confined to the continent. Colonial outposts in the Caribbean, West Africa, and Southeast Asia began producing soap using locally available materials. In the Caribbean, for example, planters discovered that coconut oil could produce a firm, high-lather soap, ideal for humid climates. In West Africa, palm oil became a key ingredient, not only for local use, but as an export commodity sent back to Europe. These colonial products often returned to European markets, where they were marketed as exotic and luxurious. The growing middle class in Europe increasingly viewed soap as an essential household item rather than a rare luxury. This shift was partly driven by changing social attitudes. The Enlightenment encouraged the belief that personal hygiene was a sign of civility and good character, while medical theories, though still primitive by modern standards, linked cleanliness to disease prevention. Printed advertisements began to appear in newspapers, promoting various brands of soap with claims of superior purity, fragrance, or health benefits. Some even marketed soap as a cosmetic product, promising to whiten hands or soften skin, reflecting the era's emphasis on appearance and refinement. Technologically, the period saw incremental improvements in the boiling and curing process, with larger cauldrons, better control of temperatures, and more precise measurements of alkali and fats. In some regions, soap makers began using soda ash produced through more controlled burning processes, leading to more consistent quality. While still far from industrial automation, these advances laid the groundwork for the mechanized production that would arrive in the 19th century. Maritime trade was the lifeline of the soap economy. Ships carried barrels of raw materials, oils, fats, alkalis, across oceans, and returned laden with finished soaps or luxury varieties for sale in Europe's wealthiest cities. In ports like Amsterdam, Lisbon, and Bordeaux, soap warehouses became common sights, and auctions of imported soaps drew merchants from far and wide. Smuggling also became an issue, particularly in England, where high taxes made illicit soap an attractive black market trade. Throughout this period, cultural associations around soap deepened. In literature and art, soap and washing scenes were used as metaphors for moral purity, renewal, and domestic order. In elite households, the possession of fine soaps, often imported and scented, was a marker of refinement, while in rural villages, homemade soap remained a humble but vital product, crafted in small batches over open fires using animal fats and wood ash. By the close of the 18th century, the stage was set for a dramatic transformation. The combination of colonial resources, expanding markets, and steady technical refinement meant that soap was poised to move from artisanal craft to industrial product. In the century to come, breakthroughs in chemistry and large-scale manufacturing would change not only how soap was made, but also how it was perceived, shifting it from a regulated luxury to an everyday necessity accessible to all. Yet, even in this pre-industrial age, the essential elements of soap making, purity of ingredients, skill in production, and an awareness of its social and economic value, remained firmly in place, connecting the soap makers of the Enlightenment with those of the ancient world. Under the gradual expansion of early civilizations, soap making in regions such as Mesopotamia, Egypt, and later the Mediterranean began to evolve from a rare and specialized craft into a more familiar household activity, although still largely confined to wealthier classes or professional workshops. In the seventh stage of this history, we see how soap transitioned from an occasional cleaning agent to a recognized product with social, economic, and cultural value. By the later centuries of the first millennium BCE, records show that mixtures of alkaline salts with animal fats or plant oils were no longer reserved only for medicinal purposes, but had entered domestic routines, particularly among urban populations. Archaeological findings in Babylonian and Egyptian settlements indicate the existence of small-scale production areas where artisans would render fat from sheep, goats, or cattle and mix it with potash-rich ash derived from burning specific plants. The result was a soft, often dark paste, with a pungent smell, stored in small clay jars or wrapped in linen for preservation. The quality and texture of these early soaps varied greatly, depending on the purity of the ingredients, the skill of the maker, and the intended use. In Egypt, for example, certain recipes incorporated aromatic resins or herbs, not primarily to clean, but to perfume the skin, aligning with cultural values that linked scent to personal hygiene and status. In Mesopotamia, temple workers and scribes sometimes received soap as part of their rations, suggesting its perceived necessity in maintaining the physical cleanliness expected of those handling sacred objects or administrative records. This period also saw the gradual standardization of measurements in soap recipes. Early scribal notes on clay tablets describe proportions of ash to fat, instructions on boiling times, and seasonal variations, important in regions where ambient temperature could affect the chemical reaction. Such documentation marks an important shift from oral tradition to written formula, which allowed techniques to be shared across generations and even traded between regions. In trade contexts, soap began to appear as a minor but steady commodity. Caravans crossing from the Levant into Egypt, or from Mesopotamia toward Anatolia, occasionally carried wrapped blocks of solidified soap-like material alongside oils and textiles. These were not mass-produced goods, but rather artisanal products valued for their rarity and utility. Socially, soap began to take on symbolic meanings. In some rituals, particularly in temple purification practices, soap or soap-like mixtures were applied to cleanse participants before entering sacred spaces. The act of washing with such a substance, beyond mere water, became a sign of deeper preparation, both physical and spiritual. This dual role, practical cleaning and ritual purification, helped ensure that soap retained a place in the cultural consciousness, even in times when its production was labor-intensive and costly. Technological advances also emerged during this stage. Some workshops experimented with adding alkaline-rich mineral powders to speed saponification, while others learned to cool and mold the mixture in carved wooden forms, producing more uniform shapes. The aesthetic element of soap making, though still secondary to function, began to matter in urban markets, where presentation could influence a buyer's choice. Historical references from Greco-Roman contact periods suggest that Mediterranean traders, upon encountering Near Eastern soaps, were intrigued by their utility, but often considered them exotic, even luxurious. This perception would later play a role in the spread of soap-making knowledge westward. Overall, this phase in the history of soap-making reflects a society learning to integrate a once specialized material into broader daily life, while still attaching to it layers of meaning that went beyond the practical. In doing so, early civilizations laid the groundwork for soap's eventual role as an everyday staple, a commodity of trade, and a tool of cultural and ritual expression, setting the stage for further refinement in the centuries to come. By the time we move into the 8th stage of soap-making history in early civilizations, the craft had begun to intersect more directly with the dynamics of expanding trade networks, regional specializations, and the gradual refinement of chemical understanding, even if that understanding was based more on empirical observation than on formal science. In this period, roughly spanning from the early centuries BCE into the first few centuries CE, soap was no longer a rare curiosity in certain urban centers. It had started to become an identifiable product with recognizable qualities that people in different cultures could describe and compare. In regions such as Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant, the methods of producing soap-like substances were steadily improving. Soap makers had learned that the quality of the ash used was crucial. Certain desert plants, when burned, yielded a higher concentration of alkaline salts, which in turn produced a smoother, more effective cleaning paste when mixed with oils or animal fats. This meant that soap makers were not only craftsmen, but also, in a sense, early resource managers, sourcing specific plants from distant regions or cultivating them locally to ensure a steady supply. The oils and fats themselves became another area of refinement. While earlier recipes had relied heavily on animal fats due to their availability, some workshops began experimenting with olive oil and sesame oil, which produced a softer lather and a less pungent smell. This shift was partly due to the influence of Mediterranean traders, who brought knowledge of oil pressing and preservation. In Egypt, where olive cultivation was not as widespread, imported oil was considered a luxury, so soaps made with it were marketed to the elite or used in temple purification rites. Economically, the trade in soap began to take on more structured forms. Small, specialized workshops appeared in bustling cities such as Thebes, Babylon, and Tyre, where soap was crafted not only for local use, but also for sale to traveling merchants. The product was shaped into more uniform blocks or pressed into rounded cakes, often stamped with simple markings to indicate the maker or the workshop of origin. These marks served as early branding, allowing buyers to recognize and request soap from a particular source, much as they might with wine or textiles. Socially, the presence of soap in everyday life began to reinforce ideas about cleanliness and status. In wealthier households, soap was stored in decorated ceramic jars and brought out for special washing before meals, ceremonies, or visits from important guests. Among the working classes, its use was more practical, washing hands and arms after labor, cleaning tools, and occasionally laundering garments. Public bathhouses, particularly in Hellenistic and later Roman-influenced cities, began to incorporate soap into their routines, not as a replacement for scraping tools like strigils, but as a complement, especially for those who could afford the extra expense. Culturally, soap was still intertwined with ideas of ritual purity. Priests in certain Mesopotamian temples continued to prescribe washing with specific soap mixtures before participating in sacred rites. In Egypt, funerary preparations sometimes included cleansing the body with perfumed soap before wrapping it in linen, underscoring its association with both the living and the dead. Technologically, there was gradual innovation in heating methods and in controlling the saponification process. Artisans discovered that sustained, moderate heat produced a more consistent texture, while rapid boiling could ruin a batch by separating the mixture too soon. Some workshops began adding mineral powders, clays, or ground herbs, not only for fragrance, but also to alter the abrasive quality of the soap, making certain types better suited for scrubbing textiles and others for personal washing. The cross-cultural exchanges of this period further enriched the craft. Traders from the Arabian Peninsula, for example, introduced resins such as frankincense and myrrh into soap recipes, giving them distinctive scents and antimicrobial properties. These ingredients, already valued for religious and medicinal purposes, made soaps more desirable among the wealthy and helped solidify their role as a luxury gift item in diplomatic exchanges. By the end of this stage, soap had established itself not only as a functional commodity, but also as a marker of cultural sophistication. Its production was still small-scale compared to later industrial periods, but it was a recognized part of urban economic life, with dedicated artisans, preferred recipes, and trade routes that carried it far beyond its place of origin. This transformation marked a critical point in the history of soap making, where tradition, experimentation, and commerce combined to push a once localized craft toward becoming a staple of the ancient world's interconnected economies and daily routines. By the 9th stage of our exploration into the history of soap making in early civilizations, the craft had reached a level of refinement where both production and distribution were deeply integrated into the economic, social, and cultural systems of the ancient world. This period, stretching from the height of the Roman Empire into the early medieval centuries, saw soap evolve from a localized craft into a product with broader geographic reach, standardized production techniques, and diverse uses that reflected the needs and values of different societies. In the Roman world, soap production benefited from the empire's vast trade networks and the cultural emphasis on bathing. While the traditional Roman bath relied on oiling and scraping the skin with a strigil, soap began to be adopted as an additional cleansing agent, especially in provinces influenced by Celtic traditions. The Celts had long made a form of hard soap from tallow and plant ash, and Roman adoption of this method led to a harder, longer-lasting bar that was easier to store and transport than the softer soaps of the Eastern Mediterranean. In large cities such as Rome, Ostia, and Pompeii, small manufacturing workshops emerged, often located near markets or ports, to facilitate the import of raw materials like olive oil, tallow, and alkaline ash from distant provinces. These workshops sometimes specialized, producing different grades of soap, coarser varieties for laundry and cleaning tools, and finer, scented varieties for personal grooming among the wealthy. In the eastern provinces, such as Syria and Egypt, the tradition of oil-based soaps persisted, with olive oil remaining the preferred base. Syrian cities like Aleppo became known for a distinctive soap made from olive oil and laurel oil, which produced a smooth greenish bar with a pleasant aroma and mild cleansing properties. These soaps were often cured for months to harden, a practice that improved their longevity and lather. Their reputation would eventually spread far beyond the region, laying the groundwork for later medieval trade in Castile and Aleppo soaps. Beyond the technical aspects, soap had also acquired symbolic and even medicinal significance. Physicians and herbalists recommended certain soap mixtures for treating skin conditions, combining fats with ash and herbal extracts like chamomile or rosemary. In some traditions, soap was linked to ritual purification before prayer or after contact with the dead, reinforcing its association with both physical and spiritual cleanliness. This dual role meant that soap was present in both the public sphere, such as in bathhouses and marketplaces, and in the private rituals of households. Economically, the soap trade began to take on an interregional character. Merchants transported soap along established caravan routes, riverways, and maritime lanes, sometimes exchanging it for luxury goods like spices, textiles, and precious metals. The stability of the Roman road system and the reach of Mediterranean shipping made it possible for soap from one part of the empire to appear in a distant province, adapted slightly to local preferences, but still recognizable in form and function. In Northern Europe, where the climate and resources differed, soap making evolved to suit available materials. Animal fats, especially from cattle and sheep, were abundant, and hardwood ashes produced a strong lye solution. These soaps tended to be darker and more pungent than their Mediterranean counterparts, but they were valued for their strength in cleaning woolens and heavy linens, essential in colder climates. The social perception of soap varied widely. In cosmopolitan urban centers, fine soap could be a small luxury, a marker of refinement in grooming. In rural communities, it was a practical necessity for maintaining clothing and tools, especially in agricultural work. In both contexts, the knowledge of soap making was often passed down through families, with some households making their own supply each year after the slaughtering season, when fats were most plentiful. As the centuries progressed and political shifts began to reshape the ancient world, soap making proved to be a remarkably resilient craft. Even as cities declined and trade routes changed with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the essential techniques and recipes for soap persisted, preserved in households, monasteries, and small urban workshops. Monastic communities, in particular, became important keepers of the tradition, producing soap for their own use and for sale, often adding herbal ingredients grown in monastery gardens. By the end of this stage in history, soap was no longer an occasional or exotic product. It was woven into the rhythms of daily life across a wide range of environments and cultures, from the warm olive groves of the eastern Mediterranean to the damp forests of northern Europe. The variations in ingredients, scent, and texture reflected the adaptability of the craft, while its continued presence across centuries and regions demonstrated its essential value. This enduring relevance set the stage for the next phases of its history, where medieval trade, urban growth, and further experimentation would transform soap making into an increasingly sophisticated and widespread industry. By the 10th and final stage of our journey into the history of soap making in early civilizations, the craft was poised to transition from an ancient household and artisanal tradition into the foundation of a specialized industry that would shape hygiene practices for centuries to come. This phase, spanning the later medieval period and leading into the early modern era, reveals how deeply soap had become embedded in economic, cultural, and even political life, as well as how its production methods, distribution, and symbolism continued to evolve across different regions. In the bustling trade hubs of the Mediterranean, such as Venice, Genoa, and Marseille, soap making developed into an organized craft regulated by guilds. These guilds oversaw quality standards, controlled access to recipes, and sometimes restricted production to members who had completed lengthy apprenticeships. The finest soaps, often produced in coastal cities with easy access to both olive oil and imported alkaline ashes from North Africa or the Levant, were prized for their smooth texture, mild scent, and ability to retain hardness over time. Marseille, in particular, became synonymous with high-quality olive oil soap, its reputation built on careful curing and strict adherence to established methods. In the Islamic world, where cleanliness was both a practical and religious imperative, soap making flourished as a respected craft. Cities like Damascus, Cairo, and Fez developed their own regional varieties, often incorporating fragrant essential oils such as rose, sandalwood, or jasmine. The Islamic Golden Age also saw advances in chemistry and distillation that refined the production of lye and improved consistency in soap batches. Trade caravans and merchant fleets carried these soaps to distant markets, where they were admired both for their effectiveness and their luxurious scents. Northern Europe, too, began to produce soaps that reflected its resources and cultural preferences. England, the Low Countries, and the Hanseatic port cities specialized in harder soaps made from animal fats and potash derived from hardwood ashes, well suited for laundering wool and linen in colder climates. In some towns, soap making was tied to other industries, such as butchering or tallow rendering, creating integrated economic networks that ensured steady supplies of raw materials. Soap had by now fully entered the realm of commerce, subject to taxation, regulation, and even political maneuvering. In certain kingdoms, soap production was declared a monopoly controlled by the crown, with revenues funneled into state treasuries. These monopolies could be lucrative enough to spark disputes between rival cities or merchant families. In some cases, smugglers transported soap across borders to evade tariffs, an indication of both its value and its demand. Beyond economics, soap's cultural significance continued to grow. In many urban households, a block of fine soap might be given as part of a dowry, a gesture symbolizing care for the future household's well-being. Apothecaries stocked medicinal soaps infused with herbs to soothe skin ailments, while perfumers experimented with blending scents into high-end varieties meant for the wealthy. Public bathhouses, still common in parts of Europe and the Middle East, relied on regular supplies of soap to meet the needs of their patrons, reinforcing its association with health and community life. In rural communities, soap making retained its seasonal rhythm, often tied to the agricultural calendar. After the autumn slaughtering, fats were rendered, ashes collected, and families gathered to produce the year's supply in large cauldrons over open fires. Children learned the craft by watching elders measure lye strength using simple tests, such as seeing if an egg would float on the surface of the solution. These traditions preserved not only the skill itself, but also the sense of soap making as a shared domestic activity, rooted in resourcefulness and continuity. By the close of this period, the basic principles of soap production, combining fats or oils with an alkaline substance to create a cleansing agent, remained unchanged from ancient times. Yet the scale, organization, and cultural context had transformed dramatically. Soap was now a staple in households from the Mediterranean coast to the North Sea, available in both humble and luxurious forms. Its manufacture could sustain entire urban districts, and its trade connected distant markets in a web of economic and cultural exchange. This final stage in the ancient and early medieval history of soap making set the stage for the technological and industrial revolutions to come. With the expansion of global trade in the centuries that followed, new oils, such as palm and coconut, would enter the craft. Scientific advances would allow for precise control of chemical processes, and soap's role in public health would gain new importance during periods of urbanization and disease prevention. But the foundation for all of these developments was laid in the practices, traditions, and innovations of these earlier centuries. The humble bars and blocks produced in village yards, monastic workshops, bustling city guilds, and coastal trading ports carried with them not only the promise of cleanliness, but also the legacy of human ingenuity, adaptation, and connection across cultures. Thank you so much for watching this video. I wish you a wonderful new day filled with luck and success in your work. See you again soon here on Sleep Whisper, on Sleep.